Hello everyone, I am the Macabre. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you from, and what time are you watching now? Sit back and relax. The Last Breath. Chapter 1. The first death, the Sanatorium of Hope, was a place of whispered rumors. Nestled in a valley far from the city, surrounded by dark towering trees, it had an almost sinister air. The patients who were admitted often came with broken minds, seeking refuge from the chaos of their own thoughts. But some, after weeks or months of treatment, would leave with blank eyes, their conditions not better but different. Dr. Victor Ramirez, the head psychiatrist, had been working here for years, and in that time he had witnessed both the healing and the inevitable decay that seemed to haunt this place. It was late one autumn night when he received the call. It was exactly 3:17 a.m. The phone rang with an urgency that pulled him from a restless sleep. "Dr. Ramirez?" The nurse's voice crackled through the receiver. "We've had an incident. One of the patients, Mr. Enriquez, he's dead, doctor." His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't uncommon for patients to pass in their sleep, but something in the nurse's tone felt off. Victor didn't wait for any further explanation. He grabbed his coat and rushed out of his quarters, the long, narrow corridors of the sanatorium stretching before him like a labyrinth in the dim light. When he entered room 402, the scene was unsettling. The dim light from the overhead bulb cast eerie shadows across the sterile white walls. Enriquez was lying still in his bed, his body pale and unnaturally stiff. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of violence. His eyes were closed, and his mouth was slightly open, as if he had died in his sleep. But what caught Victor's attention the moment he stepped closer was the mark on Enriquez's throat, a deep, circular burn like the imprint of a hot breath. It looked almost deliberate. Victor's fingers hovered over the wound, and as he studied it, a cold draft seemed to creep from the corners of the room, despite the windows being shut. He shivered involuntarily, brushing it off as a mere reaction to the damp night air. Just a coincidence, he told himself. But even as he thought it, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. He reached for the chart at the foot of the bed, scanning through Enriquez's medical history. There were no signs of physical illness, no reason why a man in relatively good health should die so suddenly. He felt an unease settle deep in his stomach. Any signs of foul play? Victor asked the nurse who had called him. She shook her head, her face pale. "No, doctor. It's as if he'd just stopped breathing." Victor nodded, but his mind was already racing. He ordered a full autopsy, though he suspected the cause would be as elusive as the strange mark on Enriquez's throat. A heart attack? A stroke? Some kind of seizure? But nothing seemed to fit. It was almost as though the man had simply expired, leaving behind only the curious, chilling sign of the burn. Days passed, and the sanatorium carried on its grim routine. The next few days brought no answers, but more strange occurrences. A few of the patients spoke in hushed whispers, of strange dreams, of feelings of being watched, of something in the air. At first, Victor dismissed it as paranoia after all. Many of his patients had vivid nightmares, especially those in advanced stages of psychological distress. But when more patients began to mention similar sensations, he began to wonder if there was something more sinister at work. The weight in the atmosphere thickened. He started to notice it himself. The air felt heavier, more suffocating, like something was pressing down on his chest whenever he walked the hallways. Then, just as he was about to dismiss his concerns, another patient passed away. This time, it was Mrs. Alvarez, a woman in her late 50s who had been undergoing treatment for severe anxiety. Her death mirrored that of Enriquez. No violence, no struggle, but a burn mark on her throat. The nurses were visibly shaken, but Victor, ever the skeptic, tried to remain composed. However, the mark on her neck was impossible to ignore. It looked exactly like the one on Enriquez's throat. But how could two patients, in separate rooms, die in such similar ways? Victor decided to investigate further. He ordered a detailed examination of the room where Mrs. Alvarez had passed. There were no unusual substances, no evidence of foul play. He checked her history for any overlooked conditions, but again, found nothing. The more he searched, the more he felt as though he was digging into an endless abyss. Something was happening, and he couldn't put his finger on it. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, was growing stronger by the day. One night, unable to sleep, Victor wandered the hallways of the sanatorium. The building seemed to stretch endlessly in the dark, each corner and doorway filled with shadows. He reached the door of room 402, where Enriquez had died. It was locked, as it should be. But as he stood there, an overwhelming sense of dread flooded his chest, and he felt the strange compulsion to open the door. His hand shook as he reached for the knob, but he stopped. Something was telling him not to go in. He backed away, but not before he noticed a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from inside the room. "He's coming." The burned breath. Victor spun around, his heart racing. There was no one there. The next morning, he was greeted with yet another death. This time, it was a young man named Lucas, who had been undergoing treatment for depression. Lucas's death was almost a carbon copy of the others. His body was found cold and stiff, and once again, a burn mark marred his throat. The cycle was starting to become too repetitive, too sinister. Victor knew this couldn't be a coincidence anymore. Something was happening to the patients, something that transcended medical explanation. The question was, what? As the days passed, Victor couldn't shake the feeling that he was slowly becoming entangled in something much darker than he could have ever imagined. The patients who had died had left behind no clear answers, only the lingering, suffocating presence of fear, a fear that seemed to be growing, feeding on their souls. And now, it was feeding on him too. Chapter 2. The Signs of Possession. The deaths were starting to pile up, but each one seemed to bring more questions than answers. The mysterious burns, the feeling of being watched, the whispers in the dark. Victor couldn't shake the thought that something supernatural was at work. The rational part of his mind screamed against it, but every time he saw another patient fall ill, another body be found, the more his grip on reason loosened. It wasn't long before the patients themselves began to exhibit disturbing symptoms. At first, it was subtle. Mrs. Paredes, a quiet woman in her late 40s, had started talking to herself in the middle of the night. Her words, unintelligible at first, soon became clearer. She would whisper phrases like, "It's coming closer," or "I can feel its breath on me." At first, Victor thought it was just another sign of the stress that many of the patients were under. But as days passed, the woman's behavior became increasingly erratic. She would stare at nothing for hours, her pupils dilated and unblinking, and her body would tremble uncontrollably. Victor had tried to calm her down, but his efforts only seemed to provoke more fear in her. One night, he entered her room to find her kneeling by the window, her hands pressed against the glass, as though trying to escape something unseen. "It's in the air," she said softly, her voice trembling. "It's everywhere. It's watching us." Her eyes darted back and forth, as if tracking something just beyond her reach. He had never seen her like this before, and the sight left him unsettled, as if the woman was no longer fully in control of her own mind. The next day, Mr. Delgado, a middle-aged man with a history of paranoia, started showing similar symptoms. He had been a stable patient for months, but suddenly, he became unrecognizable. His behavior shifted dramatically, and he began to complain of hearing voices that seemed to come from nowhere. These weren't the usual delusions of someone suffering from schizophrenia, though. No, these voices were different. They were low, rasping, and they sounded like they were coming from deep within the earth. Delgado would claw at his skin, as though something was crawling under it. His eyes rolled back in his head as if something had taken hold of him. By the time the third patient, Luis Hernandez, a young man with a mild anxiety disorder, started to show the same symptoms, Victor was no longer sure what was happening. Luis had been relatively calm during his stay, but now he screamed at night, thrashing in his bed, shouting that something was in his throat, that it was burning him. When Victor examined him, there were no visible injuries, but Luis's breath was shallow and ragged, as though he were suffocating. In the morning, he appeared disoriented, his eyes glassy and unfocused, and his voice cracked as he whispered, "It's here. It wants us all." Victor couldn't deny the parallels. The patients who had died had all shown similar signs before their deaths, mumbling in their sleep, staring into nothingness, experiencing intense physical distress for no apparent reason. And now, the remaining patients seemed to be slipping into a state of terror that was almost contagious. It was as though whatever malevolent force was tormenting the sanatorium was beginning to take hold of them, one by one. The nurse staff was starting to get nervous. Several of them, including his longtime colleague, Dr. Lucia Gomez, began voicing concerns. She had been working with Victor for years, and he trusted her judgment, but even she seemed at a loss for what was happening. "Victor, we can't keep pretending that this is just a coincidence. These patients, they're acting like they're possessed," she said one evening in a hushed tone, as if afraid someone would overhear. Victor frowned, a chill creeping up his spine. "Possessed?" he repeated, his voice low. "Lucia, that's ridiculous. There must be a medical explanation. A viral infection, perhaps? A mental breakdown on a mass scale?" Lucia shook her head, her face pale. "I don't know, but I'm telling you, something is happening here. It's like they're all losing control of themselves, and it's spreading." Just last week, one of the orderlies heard someone whispering in the halls, and when he went to investigate, he found nothing, but he swears he heard it. Something calling out. Victor had dismissed it at first, chalking it up to stress or fear, but now, with every passing day, he was becoming less sure. He spent the next few nights pacing the halls, listening for the whispers that seemed to echo through the walls. Sometimes he could hear them, soft and distant, like a breath on the wind. But when he turned the corner to investigate, there was no one there. One evening, after yet another patient had succumbed to the same strange symptoms, Victor finally decided to investigate the hospital's records, searching for any connection between the patients. He dug deep into the archives, hoping to find something that would explain the bizarre deaths and the increasingly bizarre behavior of those who survived. As he scrolled through old files, a particular name caught his eye: Dr. Arturo Medina, a physician who had worked at the sanatorium decades ago. His file mentioned something strange, an ancient ritual involving spiritual cleansing that had been performed in the hospital during its early years. Victor's hands froze as he read further. Dr. Medina's notes described how patients who had undergone the procedure reported feeling as if they were being taken by an unseen force. Some even claimed to have glimpsed shadowy figures in the corners of their rooms. The rituals had been stopped abruptly after a series of unexplained deaths in the early 1950s, but the record suggested that the practice had been hidden, covered up, and forgotten by most of the staff. The more Victor read, the more the pieces began to fall into place. Whatever was happening to his patients, it wasn't a disease, nor was it simply a coincidence. The clinic had a dark past, one buried deep in its history, and that past was now coming back to claim its victims. Victor's heart raced. He had thought the whispers were just the result of overactive imaginations, but now he was starting to believe that something much darker was at play. The strange symptoms, the unexplained deaths, the whispers, the burn marks, he couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever had happened in the past was far from over, and it was hunting those who came to the sanatorium one by one. Chapter 3. The Hidden History. Victor couldn't sleep. The weight of what he'd discovered in the records pressed down on him like an invisible hand. Dr. Arturo Medina's notes had been vague but unsettling, hinting at something far darker than a simple malpractice cover-up. It seemed as though the Sanatorium of Hope was more than just a psychiatric hospital. It was built on the site of something far older, something far more sinister. The clinic, he now realized, had not always been a sanctuary for the mentally ill. Before it had been a place for healing, it had been an old hospital that predated the modern structure by nearly a century. This original hospital, from the late 1800s, had been the site of countless strange practices, some of them bordering on the occult. The rituals that Dr. Medina had referenced were part of an ancient tradition, an attempt to commune with the spirit world, to summon dark entities. The practice was thought to be long abandoned after a series of gruesome deaths and disappearances among patients in the early 1950s, but the records hinted that the ritual had never been fully erased. It had been hidden, buried in the depths of the clinic's history, waiting to resurface. Victor began to see connections he hadn't noticed before. The burn marks on the patients' throats, the strange, almost trance-like behavior, the whispered warnings, they were all linked to a pattern that had been repeating for decades. It wasn't a new phenomenon. It was an ancient curse, one that had been triggered by the clinic's very foundations. He couldn't ignore it anymore. The deaths were part of a cycle, a dark ritual that had been set into motion long before he had ever arrived. The more Victor read, the more he felt the presence of something unseen in the halls. The air grew thicker, and the walls seemed to close in around him as he traced the clinic's history. He found a reference to an old book, a text that Dr. Medina had once studied. It was called The Rite of the Hollow Souls, an ancient grimoire detailing the summoning of a demon of being that fed on souls and could possess the living. It was said that the demon was trapped beneath the building, bound by the original rituals, but every few decades its power grew, reaching out to claim new victims. As he read the chilling details of the book, Victor felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was as if the demon, too, was watching him. Unable to focus on anything else, Victor spent the next few days scouring the clinic for any other clues. He started with the oldest parts of the building, those sections that had been sealed off after the hospital's renovation in the 1950s. The hallways in these parts were narrow, choked with dust and cobwebs, and the air smelled stale, like something long forgotten. At the end of one such corridor, he found an old wooden door, half rotted, barely hanging on its hinges. Behind it lay a small, abandoned room, its walls lined with old, crumbling bookshelves, filled with texts and languages Victor couldn't even begin to recognize. The room felt oppressive, like the weight of centuries pressed down upon him as soon as he stepped inside. A strange hum seemed to emanate from the air itself, a low, almost imperceptible vibration that made his skin prickle. He pulled a dusty book from one of the shelves and opened it. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded. It was a journal, written by Dr. Medina himself. The entries detailed the doctor's own descent into madness as he attempted to break the binding rituals that had kept the demon imprisoned beneath the clinic. In his final entries, Dr. Medina wrote of hearing whispers in the halls, of seeing shadows move just out of sight, of feeling a presence, something that had been watching and waiting for decades. Victor was horrified to read that. Dr. Medina had believed the demon could possess the living, using them as vessels to escape the confines of its prison. The rituals weren't just performed on patients, they were performed on the very building itself. The hospital had been constructed atop an ancient burial ground, a place where dark rites had been held long before the arrival of any modern doctors. The lives lost in those rites had become part of the ritual, their souls bound to the demon's will. Over time, the cycle of death and possession had repeated, each cycle feeding the demon's power, growing stronger with each passing year. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The deaths weren't random. The patients who had died, the ones who were now showing signs of possession, they were all part of a ritual, a cursed cycle that had been repeating itself every few decades. The demon, once bound, was now free to claim the souls of those unfortunate enough to enter the clinic, and it was getting stronger. The clinic wasn't just a hospital, it was a trap, a prison for the souls that had been taken, and a hunting ground for the demon's hunger. Victor's thoughts raced. He had to stop this, but how? The rituals had been long lost to history. The book that described them barely legible, the pages worn and fading. If he was going to break the cycle, he needed answers, answers that seemed to lie in the darkest corners of the clinic, beneath the very foundations where the demon had been imprisoned. The deeper he dug, the closer he came to the truth, but the more dangerous it became. The clinic was alive with the demon's presence, and it was growing impatient. Soon it would claim him too, unless he could find a way to stop it. The more Victor thought about it, the more he realized that the answer might lie in the past, specifically the original patients who had been sacrificed to the demon. If their souls were still trapped here, their energy could be the key to breaking the ritual. But to do that, he would have to find a way to communicate with the dead, to confront the demon directly. And that would require something far more dangerous than just reading ancient texts. Determined to stop the nightmare before it consumed everyone in the clinic, Victor made a decision. He would perform the ritual himself, but he knew, deep down, that there was a heavy cost. To break the demon's hold on the patients, he would need to risk everything: his sanity, his soul, and perhaps even his life. Chapter 4. The possession takes strength. The night air felt heavier than ever as Victor made his way through the clinic's corridors, the weight of the knowledge he had uncovered pressing down on him like an unbearable burden. The plan to break the cycle, to confront the demon, was forming in his mind, but he could feel the pressure mounting. It was as if the clinic itself was alive, watching him, pushing him closer to the edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. It was only a matter of hours before the next death would occur. Victor could feel it in his bones. He had been watching the patients closely, and he knew that the demon's influence was growing stronger with each passing day. Mrs. Paredes was getting worse, her trembling hands, her wide, frightened eyes, they had become the telltale signs of a slow, inevitable decline. The voices that haunted her were no longer whispers. They had grown louder, more insistent, and she had started to speak in tongues, the words tumbling from her lips like a foreign chant. She claimed she was no longer herself, that something was speaking through her, pulling her away from her body. Victor had tried to intervene, but it was clear now that he was no longer dealing with a simple mental illness. The patients who had died, the ones whose souls had been consumed by the demon, had left behind a palpable emptiness, a void that the demon was eager to fill, and now it was coming for Mrs. Paredes. Victor couldn't save her. The thought twisted in his gut. He had promised himself he would save them all, but the truth was becoming undeniable. The demon was too powerful. The sanatorium had become its hunting ground. The further Victor delved into the history of the clinic, the more he began to feel its presence, creeping into his mind like a slow poison. It started with dreams vivid, nightmarish dreams that left him drenched in sweat, gasping for breath. In these dreams, he was walking through the clinic's hallways. Only the walls were warped, contorted, and the faces of the patients twisted in grotesque expressions of pain and terror. He could hear them calling to him, their voices echoing in the darkness, their hands reaching out for him. The worst part of the dreams was the feeling of being watched. He would turn around in the corridors, only to see nothing but shadows, but the presence would still linger, heavy and oppressive. One night, as he stumbled out of his dream in a cold sweat, he was sure he heard footsteps following him down the hallway. He whipped around, but there was no one there. Only the empty, echoing silence of the clinic. But it wasn't silence. Victor had begun to notice that the whispers were no longer just confined to his dreams. They followed him now, soft murmurs that seemed to come from the walls, from the very air itself. It was as if the clinic was breathing, exhaling the curses that had been trapped here for so long. The whispers would tug at his sanity, words he couldn't fully understand, words that seemed to grow louder and more insistent as the days passed. They spoke of death, of souls trapped in limbo, of the demon's hunger. One evening, after another grueling day of tending to the patients, Victor returned to his office, his head pounding. He hadn't slept in days. He knew he needed to rest, but there was no time for that now. He was so close, closer than ever to unraveling the mystery, to freeing the trapped souls, to confronting the demon itself. He just had to finish the ritual. But as he opened the door to his office, he froze. The air was thick with an unnatural cold, and the room was darker than it should have been. His desk, once neat and orderly, was in disarray, papers scattered across the floor, books overturned, and his chair was spinning slowly, as though someone had been sitting there moments before. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Something was wrong. Something had changed. It was as if the demon had entered the room, as if it had touched everything he held dear. Victor felt a surge of panic rise in his chest, and then he heard it, the faintest whisper, a voice that was both familiar and foreign. Victor. It breathed. His name, spoken like a promise, like an invitation. The voice was low, almost seductive, but beneath it lay a deep, guttural growl that made his blood run cold. He spun around, his heart pounding in his chest, but there was no one there. No sign of anything out of place, except the coldness that seemed to have settled into his very bones. He tried to shake it off, but the whispers wouldn't leave. They followed him everywhere now, at work, in the halls, even in the silence of his own room. Sometimes he would catch glimpses of something in the corner of his eye shadows that didn't belong, figures that seemed to move when he wasn't looking. At times, it felt as though the clinic itself was alive, pulsating with malevolent energy. The demon was pushing him to the brink, pulling at his thoughts, his sanity. One night, as Victor wandered the halls in a dazed state, he heard a door creak open behind him. It was room 402, the room where Enriquez had died. The door was ajar, and a soft, reddish glow emanated from within. It beckoned him like a moth to a flame. He hesitated for a moment, then walked toward it, drawn by an invisible force. When he stepped inside, he was met with a scene that shook him to his core. The walls were covered in strange symbols he recognized from the ancient texts he had found. The room was filled with the scent of incense, thick and suffocating. At the center of the room, a figure stood, a patient he didn't recognize. The figure was shrouded in shadows, its features obscured, but its eyes glowed with an eerie red light. It turned slowly toward Victor, and for the briefest moment, the demon's true form flickered in his mind, twisted, nightmarish, a creature beyond comprehension. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Victor staggered back, his breath caught in his throat. The whispers rose to a crescendo, filling his mind with a maddening, unbearable sound. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The demon wasn't just haunting the clinic, it was the clinic. It had always been here, lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to claim everything. In that moment, Victor realized the horrifying truth. The demon was no longer just in the patients, it was in him too. He had become its next vessel. The cycle was beginning again, and this time there might be no way out. Chapter 5. The return of the demon. Victor awoke the next morning with a start, his heart racing in his chest. His entire body ached, as though he had been fighting against invisible chains throughout the night. The nightmare had been more vivid than ever. He had felt the demon's presence so intensely, so physically, that it lingered in his mind, even after he opened his eyes. He could still hear the whispering in his ears, like a soft caress that carried with it the weight of ancient promises. The clinic seemed different now. It wasn't just the oppressive air or the unnerving silence that hung over the building. There was something more, something darker, that crept into the corners of his vision. The shadows seemed longer, more distorted, and the faces of the patients, those few who were still lucid, were becoming increasingly alien, as if their very souls were slipping away, replaced by something else entirely. Victor stood by the window, staring out at the dreary sky, the gray clouds swirling in the distance. He had no idea how much time had passed. The days seemed to blend together, one after another, like an endless cycle of dread and confusion. He had tried to rest, to recover from the mental and physical toll the demon was taking on him, but it was no use. He was too far gone. The demon's presence was everywhere, now inside his thoughts, inside his very soul. As the morning went on, the symptoms among the remaining patients became more pronounced. Mrs. Paredes, once calm and gentle, had completely spiraled. She was now tied to her bed, her eyes wide and unblinking, muttering incoherently to herself. The whispers were getting louder, more insistent. Sometimes she would sit up suddenly and stare at nothing, her body trembling as if something invisible was suffocating her. And yet, when Victor examined her, there were no physical signs of distress. It was as if she were being tortured from the inside, her very essence being pulled from her. It wasn't just Mrs. Paredes. Luis, the young man who had been so calm just a few days ago, was now unrecognizable. He had started speaking in a voice that was not his own, a deep guttural tone that sent chills down Victor's spine. It was as if the demon had fully taken hold of him, using his body as a vessel for its own malicious desires. Luis's eyes no longer held any trace of humanity. They were black, pitch black, like endless voids that absorbed everything in their path. Victor's hands shook as he scribbled notes in his journal. He had been a doctor for over 15 years, and in all that time, he had never encountered anything like this. It was beyond his understanding, beyond anything he could explain. And yet, deep down, he knew it was real. The demon was alive, and it was feeding on the souls of the patients one by one. It was using them to grow stronger, to reclaim its power. The more Victor observed, the more he realized the demon wasn't just possessing them, it was changing them. It was transforming their very being, warping their bodies into something twisted and unnatural. He had already seen the signs in Enriquez, the first patient who had died. His body had been contorted in impossible ways. His limbs unnaturally bent, his throat scorched as though he had been burned from the inside out. But now, those signs were spreading. Luis, Mrs. Paredes, Victor could see the same physical deterioration beginning to take root in them. Victor had to act, and he knew he was running out of time. The ritual he had uncovered in Dr. Medina's notes was the key, but the steps to complete it were incomplete, lost to time. He needed the final piece of the puzzle, the missing ritual that would allow him to bind the demon once more, to banish it from the clinic forever. But where could he find it? The old journals, the ancient texts, all spoke of a book that had been hidden away, lost in the shadows of the clinic's forgotten past. If he could find that book, he might be able to undo the curse. But there was something more, something that gnawed at his insides. The ritual required a sacrifice, and that sacrifice would have to come from one of the living. Victor knew what that meant. He had read the details of the final step. To complete the ritual and seal the demon's fate, one life would have to be offered a willing participant who would die to release the others. It was the only way to sever the demon's hold. But who could he ask? Who would be willing to make that kind of sacrifice? And was it even possible to survive the ritual? The fear was beginning to creep into his mind, gnawing at him from within. The demon had begun to focus on him now. He could feel its cold touch every time he closed his eyes, every time he stepped into the clinic. It was as if the demon had sensed his growing desperation, his attempts to fight back. It was tormenting him, slowly wearing him down. And then there were the dreams. The dreams were no longer just dreams. They were visions, vivid and terrifying, of things that had not yet come to pass but were inevitable. He saw himself standing in the center of the clinic, surrounded by the souls of the dead, those who had been claimed by the demon over the years. Their faces were hollow, their eyes empty, their mouths open in silent screams. They reached out for him, their hands like claws begging for release. And in the distance, the demon watched, its eyes glowing with cruel amusement. It was waiting for him to make his move. Victor woke from the latest vision with a start, his heart racing. He was no longer sure if he was still in the dream, or if the demon had fully claimed him. Was he awake? Was he still himself? It was becoming increasingly difficult to tell. Every day that passed, he felt more and more like a spectator in his own life, as though the demon was controlling his every move. His thoughts were no longer his own. His body felt like it was being pulled in multiple directions, tethered to something dark and unknown. He had to act now. The demon was closing in. The patients were losing their minds, their souls already slipping away. Victor could hear them calling to him now, begging him to help, to save them. But how could he save anyone when he was no longer sure if he could even save himself? Chapter 6. The search for the cursed tome. Victor had no choice but to search the clinic from top to bottom. He knew that the book the one Dr. Medina had written about was the last hope for anyone who still lived within these walls. But the demon was waiting for him, and it wasn't going to let him get close without a fight. It was as if the clinic itself had become an extension of the demon's will, an organic, living thing that resisted his every step. The deeper he ventured into the clinic's forgotten sections, the more disorienting it became. It was as if the very architecture of the building was shifting around him. The air grew denser, thick with a palpable sense of dread, the walls closing in and the halls stretching into endless corridors. He'd spent hours wandering through parts of the clinic he hadn't even known. Existed old maintenance areas, storage rooms filled with broken medical equipment, and decaying staircases that led to nowhere. The deeper he went, the further he felt from reality, as if he had entered a twisted version of the world he knew. It was in the basement that he found the first clue. The door had been hidden behind a massive stack of old file cabinets. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years, maybe decades. The metal was rusted, and the hinges groaned in protest as he pushed it open. A foul smell wafted from the room, damp, rancid, as if something had died long ago and was still rotting in the dark. Victor held his breath and stepped inside. The room was smaller than he expected, filled with old wooden shelves that were nearly empty, except for a few scattered books. But it wasn't the books that caught his attention, it was the walls. They were covered in symbols, drawn in red ink, some faded, some still vivid. as though freshly painted. Victor's pulse quickened. These weren't just random markings. They were the same symbols he had seen in Dr. Medina's journals, the same ones that had been found in the ritual chamber. The ritual chamber where the demon had first been summoned. He moved closer, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread coil in his stomach. The symbols seemed to pulse with dark energy, almost alive, as if they were feeding on his fear. It was as if they had been waiting for him, waiting for someone who knew the meaning behind them. And then, as he touched one of the markings, his vision went black. The world tilted sideways, and for a split second he was no longer in the room. He was back in the clinic's past, walking through the halls of the old hospital. He could hear the muffled cries of patients, the clanging of metal, the whispers of doctors speaking in hushed tones. But there was something else, a presence, lurking in the background, watching him. He could feel it, its eyes boring into him, cold and hungry. The sensation was overwhelming, suffocating. The demon was there, in the past, in the very foundation of the clinic, waiting to be unleashed. Victor stumbled back, gasping for air. The vision faded, and he was back in the basement, his hands still resting on the symbol. He felt disoriented, his mind reeling from what he had just experienced. But there was no time to think. He had to find the book. He knew now that the symbols were a part of the ritual, tied to the demon's power. The book he was looking for had to be here somewhere, buried beneath all the madness. He searched the room frantically, his heart racing as his hands flew over the shelves, brushing aside dust and debris. And then, beneath a stack of old ledgers, he found it, a thick, leather-bound tome, its cover cracked with age. The edges were frayed, the pages yellowed, but it was unmistakable. It was The Rite of the Hollow Souls, the book he had been searching for. It had been here all along, waiting for him to uncover it. Victor hesitated for only a moment before pulling the book from its hiding place. The air around him seemed to shift, and for the first time in days, he felt a chill run down his spine, not from the cold, but from the dark energy that emanated from the book. The whispers were louder now, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and writhe. He couldn't help but feel the demon's presence, pressing in on him, its malevolent gaze fixing on him as though it knew what he had found. He opened the book carefully, his fingers trembling as he turned the brittle pages. The text was written in a language he didn't recognize, a mix of ancient symbols and phrases. But there, in the margins, Dr. Medina had made notes in English. Desperate, Victor leaned closer, reading through the hurried scrawl. It was a guide, a step-by-step ritual to summon and banish the demon. But there was more. The final pages of the book were dedicated to the most important part of the ritual, the sacrifice. It wasn't enough to just complete the ritual. The demon required a soul, a willing soul, to take its place in the abyss. Without the sacrifice, the ritual would fail, and the demon would be free to roam the world once more. The soul would be trapped in the demon's realm, its body left to wither and die, while the demon would be bound once more, imprisoned in the clinic's foundations. Victor closed the book, his stomach turning. The ritual was clear now, but the sacrifice, there was no way around it. He would have to find someone willing to die, to offer their soul in exchange for the lives of the others. The thought twisted in his gut. But it wasn't just the sacrifice that terrified him. It was the fact that the demon was already waiting for him to make his move. The clinic was beginning to hum with an unnatural energy, and Victor felt his heart race in response. He had no more time to waste. He had the book. He had the ritual. But now, he had to make the most difficult decision of his life. Who would be willing to make the ultimate sacrifice to stop the demon, to save the souls of the patients, to break the curse? He couldn't do it alone. He had to find someone, a willing soul. But as he left the basement, the shadows seemed to move closer, the whispers grew louder, and the walls of the clinic began to pulse with a dark rhythm. The demon was no longer just watching. It was preparing for the final act. Chapter 7. The sacrifice needed. Victor sat alone in his office, the book open in front of him, the heavy silence pressing in from all sides. His hands trembled as he reread the final passage, the part about the sacrifice. The words seemed to burn themselves into his mind, every syllable sinking deeper into his consciousness, like an unshakable curse. A sacrifice was the only way to stop the demon. But who? Who could he possibly ask to offer their life in exchange for the lives of the others? He thought of Mrs. Paredes, her eyes wide with terror, her body racked with the invisible torment the demon inflicted on her. He thought of Luis, his voice now nothing more than a hollow echo of the man he once was. And the others, the patients who had already fallen victim to the demon's insidious grasp. They were already lost, but there were still some left. Could he ask any of them to make that kind of decision? Victor rubbed his temples, the pressure building in his skull. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed help, but the choice, the decision, it was something he couldn't force on anyone. He couldn't make them understand the weight of what was at stake. And yet, deep down, he knew that time was running out. The demon was closing in on him, on all of them. He could feel its presence in the very walls of the clinic, its cold, suffocating grip tightening with each passing hour. The clinic itself seemed to be growing darker. The lights flickered intermittently, casting long, distorted shadows across the halls. The whispers had intensified. Every time Victor moved, he felt the press of unseen eyes, the weight of the demon's gaze following him, waiting for him to make his move. He had the book, he had the ritual, but without the sacrifice, it was all meaningless. As the hours passed, Victor found himself wandering the halls once more, the book clutched tightly in his hands. He had to find someone who would be willing to die for the greater good. It was a thought that twisted his insides, but he couldn't ignore the reality any longer. The demon had already taken so many lives. It wouldn't stop until it had them all. He passed by the patients' rooms, each one silent, each door closed. He couldn't bring himself to look inside. He had seen the hollow, lifeless eyes of those who had already succumbed to the demon's influence, and he couldn't bear to see it again. He knew the faces of the ones who would be next, the ones the demon had marked. But none of them were the answer. None of them could make the choice. Victor's mind kept returning to one name, Elena. She was a nurse, a quiet, kind woman who had worked at the clinic for years. She had never shown any signs of fear, of the overwhelming dread that clung to the walls of the clinic. But she had been with him from the beginning, helping him care for the patients, supporting him when the others began to fall apart. She was strong. She had to be. She was the one who would understand the enormity of the sacrifice. She would do it. Victor found her in the break room, sitting alone, her head down, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up when he entered, a soft smile tugging at her lips, but Victor didn't smile back. The weight of the decision hung heavily in the air between them. "Elena," Victor said, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. "I need to talk to you." She looked at him curiously, sensing the urgency in his tone. "Of course, Dr. Ramirez. What's going on? You look—" She trailed off, her brow furrowing as she saw the look in his eyes. "What happened? Is it about the patients? They're getting worse, aren't they?" Victor nodded, unable to put it into words. The truth was too much, too terrible. He had to tell her everything, the demon, the ritual, the price. But could he? Could he truly ask her to give up her life to save the others? The thought felt like a weight pressing down on his chest, squeezing the breath out of him. "Elena," he began again, his voice shaking. "There's something I need to tell you, something you might not believe. The clinic, it's cursed. The demon that's been killing the patients, it's real, it's here. And there's only one way to stop it. I need someone to make a sacrifice." Her face softened, concern flooding her features. "Victor, I don't understand. What kind of sacrifice?" His eyes darted to the floor, unable to meet hers. "A life, a soul. One of us has to offer themselves willingly to banish the demon. Otherwise, it will continue forever." Elena was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on Victor. The weight of his words seemed to settle in the space between them, thick and oppressive. She didn't speak, but her eyes said everything she understood. She had seen what the demon could do. She had witnessed the horrors, the deaths, the slow, agonizing decay of the patients. And now she was being asked to give up everything. Victor could see the conflict in her eyes. He could see her hesitation, the fear. It wasn't just fear for herself. It was fear for him, for the others, for the world outside these walls. Could she truly make the decision to sacrifice her life to stop the demon? Could anyone? I can't ask you to do this," Victor said, his voice breaking. "It should be me. I should be the one. But I can't make you do this." "Elena," he whispered, his hand shaking as he reached for hers. I know what I'm asking, but the demon won't stop until it has every last soul here. We have to end it. We can't let it take any more. Her eyes were steady now, no longer filled with uncertainty. They were filled with resolve. She squeezed his hand, a faint smile appearing on her lips, though it was tinged with sadness. You're not asking me, Victor. You're asking the only one who can make the choice, the one who can end this. And there it was. The decision had been made, not by Victor, but by Elena. She had chosen. She had made the ultimate sacrifice, not because she was forced to, but because she knew it was the only way to save the others. To stop the demon. Victor felt the tears sting his eyes, but he couldn't speak. He couldn't find the words. He had found his sacrifice, but the cost was unbearable. Elena was going to die, and he would have to watch her go, knowing it was the only way to break the cycle. Chapter 8. The final confrontation. The clinic had never felt so alive. The walls seemed to hum with energy, an ominous pulse that vibrated in the air. The very floor beneath Victor's feet trembled, as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And it was. The demon was waiting. It knew that the ritual was nearing its end, that the time for its reign was about to come to a close, but it would not go quietly. Victor stood at the threshold of the ritual room, his heart hammering in his chest. Elena was already inside, preparing herself for what was about to unfold. The room had been cleansed, the symbols drawn, the candles lit, everything was in place, but nothing could prepare them for the terror that was about to take hold. The ritual would require everything: life, soul, body. The stakes could not have been higher. Elena was standing by the center of the room, her face pale but determined. She had changed since the night they had spoken. There was a quiet strength about her now, an inner peace that Victor couldn't quite understand. It wasn't resignation, it was acceptance. She knew what had to be done, and she had made her peace with it. And yet, the fear was still there, hidden beneath the surface. She had never shown it, but Victor could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating. "Are you ready?" Victor asked, his voice barely a whisper. He hadn't meant to say it like that, as if there was any possibility that they could back out now. The decision had been made, but the words still escaped him, a futile attempt to cling to any semblance of control over the situation. Elena nodded slowly, her eyes meeting his. "I have to do this, Victor. I don't have a choice. None of us do." The room around them seemed to darken, the shadows creeping in, stretching long and thin like tendrils reaching for the light. The demon's influence was growing stronger with every passing second, its presence like a heavy weight pressing on their chests, suffocating them. It was aware of their actions, aware of what they were about to attempt, and it was not going to let them do it without a fight. Victor could feel the temperature drop. A chill ran down his spine, and he instinctively stepped closer to Elena, though he knew there was nothing he could do to protect her now. The ritual required both of them to stay in place, to follow the steps exactly as they were written in the cursed book. Any deviation could result in failure, and failure would mean the demon would be freed, its grip on the clinic becoming even more unbreakable. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening crash. The candles flickered violently, casting twisted, erratic shadows on the walls. The air grew thick with the stench of sulfur, burning flesh, and something worse, something foul that made Victor gag. The demon was here. A low growl echoed through the room, deep and guttural. Victor's blood ran cold as he turned toward the source of the sound. At first he saw nothing, just the darkness pressing in from every corner of the room. But then, from the farthest corner, the shadows began to move. A figure emerged from the blackness, its form distorted, half human, half monster, its body writhing with unnatural movement. The demon was manifesting, its true shape coming into view for the first time. Victor's breath hitched in his throat. The creature before them was indescribable. Its face was a patchwork of tortured, twisted human features, its eyes glowing with an unearthly light. The air around it shimmered with heat, and every step it took seemed to crackle with malevolent energy. It was no longer just a presence, an invisible force. It was here, in the flesh. And it was hungry. Elena stepped forward, undeterred, her voice calm but firm. "We're ready," she said, her words ringing out like a challenge. "You're going to leave this place, demon. We won't let you take any more lives," the demon hissed, its voice like 1,000 whispers colliding into one. "Foolish mortal," it sneered. "You think you can stop me? You think your pathetic ritual will bind me? You are nothing but a vessel, a tool, and I will feast on your soul before the night is through." Victor's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. Elena's words were bold, but the terror in her eyes was unmistakable. She knew that this would be her last moment. She had accepted it. But Victor couldn't help but feel the crushing weight of helplessness as he realized that the demon's power had grown far beyond anything they could have anticipated. Could they really succeed? Could they truly banish it from this place forever? The demon advanced, its steps slow but deliberate, as though savoring the fear it had instilled. Victor felt the temperature drop even further, the room now a frozen tomb, his breath visible in the air. Elena was still standing her ground, but her body was trembling, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Victor stepped into the circle, the ancient symbols drawn on the floor glowing faintly in the dim light. His heart was racing, but his focus was sharp. He had to trust in the ritual. He had to believe that it would work. There was no other choice. "Elena," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "we can do this. Just stay strong. Stay with me. I'll be with you." The demon snarled, its form writhing as though it were being torn between two worlds. The ritual had begun. The air crackled with dark energy as Victor recited the incantation from the book. The words seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the building, the ground beneath them shaking violently as the demon fought against the binding spell. Its eyes flashed with fury as it roared, a deafening sound that rattled the windows and sent a wave of dread through the room. Victor felt his voice falter as the energy in the room began to surge. It was working. It had to be working. Elena's expression had softened, her face radiating a strange kind of serenity, as though she had already transcended the mortal world. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, it was as if the demon's power was no longer a threat. She had embraced her fate, but then with a final, terrible scream, the demon lunged forward. The ritual was not over. The battle for Elena's soul had just begun. Chapter 9. The Last Breath. The demon's roar reverberated through the room like the sound of 1,000 tortured souls. Its form was a twisting mass of shadows and flesh, impossibly large, as though it existed in multiple dimensions at once. The air crackled with dark energy, the very space around them warping, bending, as if the fabric of reality itself was unraveling. Victor could feel the oppressive weight of it pushing down on his chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. Elena's body was rigid, but her face remained calm, her eyes closed in concentration as she stood in the center of the ritual circle. The markings on the floor glowed with an eerie blue light, pulsating with the rhythm of the incantation Victor was reciting. His voice trembled, but he pushed on, the words from the cursed book slipping from his mouth in a blur. It was all he had left. The ritual was their only chance. The demon screeched again, its voice shifting into a million different tones, a cacophony of guttural laughter and pained screams. It was toying with them. It knew they were close to completing the ritual, but it was not going to make it easy. The floor beneath Victor's feet cracked with each step the demon took toward them. Its claws scraped against the stone, leaving deep gouges in the earth, and the room seemed to close in, the walls pulsing with a sickening, fleshy throb. Victor could feel the sweat dripping down his back, his hands trembling as they gripped the book. He had to finish this. Elena had already made the ultimate sacrifice. She was giving her life, her soul, to stop the demon, to free the trapped souls of the other patients. But if the ritual failed, if he faltered in even the slightest way, they would both be lost. "Elena," he gasped, his voice raw, desperate. "Stay with me, please. Don't let go. You're almost there, just a little longer." Her eyes flickered open, and for the briefest moment, their gazes locked. There was no fear in her eyes, only acceptance. But there was something else too, something that tore at Victor's heart. It was love, a quiet, unspoken connection between them. She didn't need to say anything. Her resolve spoke louder than words ever could. She had already made her peace. The demon lunged, its body moving faster than should have been possible, its claws slashing through the air. A wave of heat washed over Victor, as the creature's breath hit him like a furnace blast. He stumbled backward, the book almost slipping from his hands, but he steadied himself. "No!" he shouted, forcing his voice to stay steady. He had to finish the incantation. He couldn't let the demon win. The light in the room flickered violently, the candles now sputtering, their flames twisted into black smoke. The demon hissed, a horrific, gurgling sound, as its face morphed, contorting into shapes that were almost human but not quite, something alien, something horrific. Victor could see the tortured faces of the souls it had consumed, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths frozen in silent screams. It was feeding off them, pulling them into itself, growing stronger with each passing second. He could feel Elena's presence beside him, a stillness in the midst of the chaos. He didn't look at her. He couldn't afford to lose focus. The demon was almost upon them, its massive claws slashing at the air, its mouth opening wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth that seemed to stretch on forever. It was ready to devour them both, to claim them as its next victims. But Victor couldn't let that happen. He couldn't lose her. He couldn't let the demon's nightmare continue. The chant was almost finished, just a few more words. His voice faltered as he whispered the final incantation, but somehow, through the terror, through the sheer weight of the demon's presence, the words came out. The ground beneath them began to tremble violently, the symbols on the floor glowing brighter, the air growing thicker, heavier with each passing second. The demon let out a furious screech, as if it had been struck. Its form began to flicker, the edges of its body warping and bending. For a moment, it seemed to hesitate, its shape collapsing in on itself like a deflating balloon. But it wasn't over. The creature was still powerful, still a force that could destroy them all. Suddenly, Elena collapsed to her knees, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her body shook, and for the first time, Victor saw the fear in her eyes. It wasn't for herself, but for what was happening to her. The ritual was pulling her apart, her very soul being torn from her body. But she held on. She had to hold on. There was no turning back now. "Elena!" Victor screamed, rushing to her side. He grabbed her hand, but she was already slipping away. Her skin was cold, her body growing weaker with every passing second. The demon was fighting the ritual, trying to keep her from fully surrendering. It wanted her soul. It wouldn't stop until it had consumed everything. But Elena was still holding on. Victor felt the strength in her hand, the resolve in her grip. She had made the sacrifice. She was ready to give everything to end this. The demon roared one last time, its body convulsing violently. The very room seemed to collapse inward, as if the world itself was being sucked into a void. Victor could feel the pull, the unbearable force drawing them both in. The ritual was at its peak. Elena's soul was leaving her body, but with it, she was taking the demon's power. The light around them flared, bright enough to blind, and then, in a flash, everything went black. Chapter 10. The last breath the world was silent. For a moment, it felt as though everything had frozen in time, frozen in the dark, suffocating stillness of the clinic, as if nothing had ever existed before. The air was thick with the remnants of the demon's malevolent presence, the room still crackling with dark energy, though now fading like a distant thunderstorm retreating to the horizon. But there was no sound, no movement. It was as if the universe itself had held its breath. Victor blinked, his mind struggling to focus through the haze of exhaustion, pain, and dread. His body was cold, as if the warmth of his life had been drained away. His throat was tight, and every breath felt like a battle against something invisible that tried to smother him. He couldn't tell if he was alive, or if he had passed beyond the veil, carried away by the ritual's final toll. But then, a sharp, painful breath tore from his chest, and he knew he was still here. "Elena," he whispered, his voice breaking as he turned toward the center of the room. Her form was there, lying motionless within the ritual circle. She looked peaceful, serene even, her face calm as if she were merely sleeping. Her skin had a faint, ethereal glow to it, as if the very essence of her soul had left her body, leaving only a shell behind. But her eyes, they were closed, and the terror that had once filled them was gone. The light in them had vanished, and now they were simply empty. She had given everything. Victor felt a raw, unbearable grief tear through him. She was gone. Her sacrifice had been the only way. The demon was no more. But the price had been her life, and he had failed to stop it. He had failed her. His hands, still trembling, reached for her, but before he could touch her, the clinic's lights flickered back on, the harsh, fluorescent glow illuminating the room in its sterile, unforgiving light. The silence was broken, replaced by the soft hum of electricity, but there was no comfort in it. There was nothing but the crushing weight of the consequences. The air felt different now, quieter somehow. The suffocating presence of the demon had faded, and the building seemed to exhale a collective sigh, as if it had been holding in a scream for decades. But the emptiness that followed was far worse than the terror. The air felt hollow, as if all the souls it had consumed had been released, and now there was nothing left. Only the stillness. Victor knelt beside Elena's body, his hand hovering over her forehead but unable to make contact. The reality of the situation crashed down on him in waves. He had done it. The ritual had worked. The demon was gone. The souls that had been trapped, including those of the patients, were freed. But Elena, she had paid the ultimate price. Her voice whispered in his ear, but he knew it wasn't truly her. It was the remnants of her spirit, the last echo of her will that remained after the ritual. He could hear her faintly in the back of his mind, as if she were speaking to him from another realm. "It's over," she said, though her words were soft, distant, and fading with each breath. "Don't blame yourself, Victor. We did it. We saved them." Victor closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. He had failed her, but she had left him with one final gift, the knowledge that she didn't regret it. She had known what she was doing, and she had been ready. But he hadn't been ready. He wasn't ready for this kind of loss, not for someone he had come to care for so deeply. He reached down to touch her hand, his fingers brushing the cold, lifeless skin of her wrist. His touch was gentle, but his heart was heavy. "I'm sorry, Elena," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I should have..." But the words died in his throat as he looked around the room. The clinic was quiet, yes, but it was no longer empty. The patients, who had once been possessed, those who had survived the demon's grip, stood at the edge of the room. Their faces were tired, haunted, but their eyes were clear, free of the madness that had once consumed them. They were no longer just victims of the demon. They were survivors. Victor saw Luis first, his eyes still bloodshot, but now filled with something that hadn't been there before. "Hope, Dr. Ramirez," Luis said, his voice hoarse but steady. We're free. You did it." Victor couldn't speak. His throat was dry, and his chest felt as though it might cave in under the weight of everything. The faces of the other patients were filled with a mix of confusion and relief, but none of them spoke. They didn't need to. They knew. They knew that Victor had done the impossible, that he had ended the terror. But he had done so at the cost of Elena's life. "I couldn't save her," Victor murmured, his voice thick with sorrow. "I couldn't save her from the demon." "You didn't have to." Another patient, a woman named Clara, spoke up. "She saved us all. She saved you. Don't you see? The demon's gone. The souls that were trapped, they're free." Victor looked up, the tears still falling, but a strange, hollow kind of relief washing over him. He had done it. He had stopped the demon. The lives that had been stolen from these walls were no longer lost. Elena's sacrifice had worked. She had done what no one else could, but the cost was unbearable. For the next few hours, the patients began to leave, one by one. The clinic was no longer a place of fear. It was a place of healing, a place for recovery. And Victor remained, standing in the center of the ritual circle, staring down at the lifeless form of the woman who had given her life to save them all. The door to the clinic opened, and as the last patient walked out into the cold night, Victor's eyes fell to the floor, his hands pressed together in a silent prayer. His work here was done, but there would never be peace. Not for him. Not for Elena. As the door swung shut behind the last of the survivors, Victor whispered one final goodbye to the woman who had given him everything. "Thank you for everything." And with that, the clinic fell silent once more, its walls now empty of the demon's influence. But the memories of those who had died, those who had been sacrificed, would never leave him. Not in this lifetime. The House of the Last Sigh. Chapter 1. The Forbidden Entrance. The evening was settling into the kind of oppressive silence that only comes with a heavy fog, thick and damp, rolling in from the hills surrounding the city. 5 friends stood at the edge of the road, gazing up at the mansion that had haunted local legends for decades. La Casa del Último Suspiro, the house of the last sigh, loomed before them, a massive silhouette against the darkening sky. Its windows, empty and black, seemed to watch them, and a chill ran through their spines despite the warmth of the night. "Are we really doing this?" whispered Anna, her voice trembling. She tried to sound brave, but even she couldn't deny the weight of the air around the mansion. There was something wrong with this place, something ancient and hungry. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. They were whispered in hushed tones in the city's crowded cafes and by firelight in the homes of the elderly. The mansion was cursed, they said. No one who had dared enter had ever returned. But there they were, standing at its gates, about to defy every warning. Javier, the most daring of the group, grinned and stepped forward, his boots crunching the gravel beneath his feet. "I'll go first," he declared, his voice full of bravado. He had always been the leader, the one who pushed the others into situations they would normally avoid. "There's no curse, just a bunch of superstitious nonsense. This will be the best story we'll ever have." His words were meant to convince, but even as he spoke, his hand lingered near his jacket pocket, as though clutching for something, perhaps for courage, or perhaps to hold back the unease creeping up his spine. David, standing just behind him, tugged his jacket tighter around his shoulders, his face pale in the dimming light. "I don't know, man," he muttered, glancing nervously at the mansion. "What if there's something to it? What if the stories aren't just stories?" But he didn't protest further. His curiosity always had a way of getting the best of him, no matter how much he tried to fight it. The mansion stood in absolute silence, save for the distant rustle of leaves in the trees surrounding it. The iron gates were rusted and barely hanging on their hinges, yet they creaked open, as if inviting them in. The others hesitated for a moment, casting glances at one another. It was as though the mansion itself was beckoning them, daring them to enter. "Come on," Javier urged, his voice louder now, almost impatient. "We came here to prove it's all fake, right?" With that, he pushed the gate open fully, the sound of metal scraping against metal, sending a jarring note through the night. The gate groaned in protest, as if not wanting to let them pass, but it fell open with a final eerie squeal. The fog rolled in thicker, swallowing the path ahead, making the mansion seem even more distant and unreachable. But still, they followed. The path leading to the mansion was overgrown, vines twisting up the crumbling stone walls like veins. The air had a stale, oppressive quality, and the smell of mildew and decay was thick in their nostrils. They walked in single file, their footfalls muffled by the mist, but the sound of their own breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. As they reached the grand front door, Javier didn't hesitate. He reached for the brass handle, its surface tarnished and cold to the touch. The door opened with surprising ease, and a gust of damp air poured out from within. The interior was dark and smelled of rot and old wood. The vast foyer stretched out before them, its walls lined with faded portraits of men and women, whose eyes followed their every movement. The silence inside was heavy, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to make the first move. Anna shivered, stepping back slightly, but the others had already crossed the threshold, stepping into the gloom of the mansion. "You all can back out now," Javier said, his voice echoing too loudly in the silence. "You heard the stories, but I'm telling you, it's just a house." He walked further into the dark hallway, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. But as he turned the corner, a strange sound stopped him, like a faint, echoing sigh, coming from deep within the mansion. He paused, his flashlight flickering slightly, but when he looked back at the others, they were frozen in place, their faces pale. "What is it?" Anna asked, her voice trembling. They all strained to hear, but the sigh had stopped. The air felt heavier now, almost as if the house itself had taken notice of their presence. David swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's a draft, or the house settling. Let's stick together." But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, and not by the portraits on the walls. The mansion had not just invited them in it, had opened its doors for a reason. The question wasn't whether they would survive the night, but whether they would ever leave at all. Chapter 2. The First Clue. The air inside the mansion grew colder as they moved deeper, their footsteps echoing off the cracked marble floors. Each room they passed was darker than the last, and the oppressive silence seemed to grow heavier with every turn. The walls, once grand, were now peeling and decaying, the faded tapestries hanging limp, their once vibrant colors swallowed by time and neglect. There was an unsettling stillness in the air, as if the house had been waiting for their arrival. Javier led the group, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, revealing glimpses of faded grandeur, shattered chandeliers, overturned furniture, and dust-covered mirrors that reflected their movements like ghostly silhouettes. They reached a large door at the end of the hallway, its surface covered in what looked like old, brittle vines, yet somehow still standing firm against the ravages of time. Javier reached for the handle, but as his hand made contact, a strange shiver ran down his spine. It was as if the house itself had recoiled. The others could see the hesitation on his face, but before anyone could speak, he pushed open the door. The room beyond was unlike the others. It was smaller, almost like a study, and it appeared untouched by time, save for the thick layer of dust that coated everything. There was a large wooden desk against one wall, its surface littered with papers, old books, and a tarnished silver candelabra. A single chair sat behind the desk, its back facing the door, as if someone had left in a hurry but never returned. But what caught their attention wasn't the desk or the books, it was the large, ornate chest in the corner, its lock rusted but still intact. "I don't like this," Anna muttered, her eyes darting nervously around the room. There was something about this space that didn't feel right. It was too preserved, too still. She could almost hear the faint sound of whispers, as if the room was alive with secrets. Javier, ever the skeptic, walked straight to the chest and knelt in front of it. "It's just an old chest, probably full of junk, but let's see what's inside." He grasped the lock, but as he touched it, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. His breath became visible in the air, a small puff of fog escaping his lips. A chill ran through the room, making every one of them shiver involuntarily. "Javier, maybe we should leave it alone," David suggested, his voice quivering. He was already backing away from the chest, uneasy. He wasn't sure what it was, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. His eyes kept flicking to the dusty papers on the desk, where a few sheets of parchment were slightly disheveled, as though someone had carelessly left them behind in a hurry. But Javier didn't listen. He pulled at the chest's lock with determination, the rusted metal creaking in protest. With a sudden snap, it gave way. The group flinched, as if the chest had sighed in relief, and the lid creaked open with a noise that sounded too loud in the silence. Inside, there was nothing but a single, weathered book. Its leather cover was cracked, and the pages inside were yellowed and brittle. Javier hesitated for a moment before reaching in and pulling it out. He dusted it off, revealing the strange symbol embossed on the cover, a twisted, snarling face, half human, half beast. Is this a journal?" Ana asked, her voice barely audible. Javier flipped through the first few pages, his eyes scanning the ancient writing. It was in a language none of them recognized, but some of the words seemed familiar, distorted versions of Latin or some forgotten tongue. "I think this is it," Javier murmured. "This could be the key to everything. This might tell us who lived here, why they disappeared." But as he spoke, a cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing the candles on the desk and making the pages of the book flutter wildly, as though the book itself were alive, reacting to their presence. Before anyone could comment, a low rumble echoed from somewhere deep within the mansion. The walls seemed to tremble, and the floor beneath their feet vibrated slightly, as though something was shifting in the house's foundations. It was a sound that felt too deliberate to be natural, as though the house itself had just taken notice of their intrusion. "We should get out of here," Ana said, her voice barely a whisper. But the others didn't seem to hear her. Javier was already reading the journal aloud, his eyes scanning the cryptic text with growing intensity. As he read, his voice grew lower, almost a murmur, as if the words were drawing him in, pulling him deeper into their meaning. "I don't know what this is saying," Javier admitted, frustration in his voice. "But it's talking about rituals and a pact, a deal with something called the Lord of the Abyss. It's like they gave up their souls for power." He turned the page, his eyes widening as something caught his attention. "Wait, it's describing a ritual that could open a doorway, a gateway." The rest of the group gathered around him, leaning over his shoulder to get a glimpse of the ancient text. But as they did, something caught their eye in the far corner of the room. A painting, partially hidden by a thick layer of dust, revealed the faintest outlines of a familiar figure. It was a man, wearing an elaborate black cloak, his face obscured in shadow. But it was the symbol on his chest, a twisted, snarling face that made their blood run cold. That's the same symbol as on the book," David exclaimed, his voice cracking with unease. Before anyone could respond, a sudden, deafening bang rang out from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and too heavy to belong to any of them. Chapter 3. The Shadow of the Past. The footsteps above them grew louder, reverberating through the house like a heartbeat, slow but unmistakable. Each thud seemed to echo deeper into the darkness, as if the mansion itself was alive, aware of their every move. The group stood frozen, their breaths shallow, listening intently. No one moved. No one spoke. Ana's heart pounded in her chest, and her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the desk, trying to steady herself. "Did you hear that?" David whispered, his voice barely audible over the heavy silence that had followed the footsteps. The air around them seemed to thicken, pressing in on them from all sides, and it felt like the walls were inching closer with each passing second. Javier, still holding the journal, glanced nervously at the others. "It's probably just the house settling," he said, but even his voice lacked conviction. The rational explanation was no longer enough to calm the growing unease. His eyes darted around the room, from the flickering candle flames to the peeling wallpaper that seemed to pulse as though breathing. Another creak, louder this time, came from the ceiling above, followed by the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. It was deliberate, methodical. Someone was moving upstairs. The air grew colder, and a strange sensation washed over them all. They were being watched, not by the portraits or the shadows, but by something far older, far darker. Something that knew they were trespassing, and it was angry. I don't want to stay here anymore," Ana said, her voice trembling as she backed away from the desk. She reached for the door, but it slammed shut with a violent bang before she could touch the handle. The suddenness of the noise made everyone jump, and for a moment, no one could move. They were trapped in that room just like the countless others who had come before them, perhaps. The house itself had claimed them. "Okay, this is enough," David said, his tone sharp with panic. He rushed to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. He pushed and pulled with all his strength, his face red with effort, but it remained firmly shut, as if the mansion itself had sealed them inside. The room felt smaller now, suffocating. The walls seemed to be closing in, as if they were being compressed by some unseen force. From the far corner of the room, there was a soft rustling, like paper being turned over. They all spun around, eyes wide with fear, but there was no one there. The desk, the chest, everything was exactly as they had left it, but the journal, Javier's journal, had moved. It was now lying open on the desk, its pages fluttering in a breeze that wasn't there. The temperature had dropped further, and their breath hung in the air like fog, swirling and dissipating in the unnatural chill. Anna's lips were turning blue, and she could feel the cold creeping into her bones. She had never been so terrified in her life, and every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to escape, to find the door. "Guys, we need to leave." "Now," Anna repeated, her voice cracking as she backed toward the window. The glass was fogged up, but she could just make out the shape of the house's sprawling gardens below, shrouded in darkness. But as she turned, her eyes fell on something else. A figure, standing in the shadows near the door, watching them. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. The figure was tall, draped in tattered black robes, its face obscured by a hood. The air around it seemed to warp, as if reality itself bent around its presence. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, as though waiting, watching, waiting for something, perhaps, for them to make the first move. Who are you? Javier asked, his voice barely a whisper, his hand gripping the journal so tightly his knuckles were white. But the figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to move, its movements jerky, unnatural, as if it was being pulled forward by an unseen force. The room seemed to contract with every step it took, the walls closing in tighter and the floorboards creaked underfoot as if groaning in pain. Anna gasped, stepping backward into David, who had gone pale, his eyes wide in terror. "It's not real. It's not real," he muttered under his breath. But even he didn't believe it. The figure moved toward them with deliberate slowness, and in the flickering candlelight, its shadow stretched unnaturally long, as if the very darkness itself was reaching for them. Without warning, the figure stopped just a few feet from them. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and the air became so thick it was hard to breathe. The figure raised its hand slowly, and with a soft, almost inaudible whisper, it spoke, its voice like dry leaves scraping across a forgotten grave. "You have come too far. Leave or be bound." The words echoed in the room, reverberating in their skulls. The door behind them, which had been sealed moments earlier, groaned as if it, too, was responding to the figure's command. The room seemed to pulse, its walls contracting with the sound of a heartbeat, slow and steady, like the rhythm of the house itself. Before they could react, the figure vanished, fading into the shadows like smoke. The door creaked open by itself, the cold wind from the hallway pouring into the room, scattering dust and debris across the floor. The house had let them go. For now. "Let's go," Javier said, his voice hoarse as he grabbed Anna's arm, pulling her toward the door. No one said a word as they rushed through the hallway, the shadows of the mansion stretching like claws after them. They didn't stop until they were outside, the cold night air hitting their faces, bringing them back to the world of the living. But as they looked back at the mansion, they saw something that made their blood run cold. Standing at one of the windows was the same figure, its face hidden in the darkness, watching them. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Chapter 4. The dark packed the air outside, was biting, the chill of the night seeming to sink deeper into their skin. They stood in a huddle, staring back at the looming mansion, which seemed to grow darker the longer they looked at it. Javier was the first to speak, though his voice was weak, betraying the fear they all felt. "We can't just leave," he said, the words coming out more like a question than a statement. "There's something here, something we need to understand." Anna shook her head, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Javier, that thing we saw, it wasn't human. We need to get out now. We're not prepared for whatever that is." David, who had been silent up until now, nodded in agreement, his face pale and drawn. "She's right. Whatever it is, it's not normal. I've never felt anything like that before." His voice cracked as he spoke, but the terror in his eyes was unmistakable. "We need to leave before it's too late." But Javier, ever the leader, refused to back down. He clenched the journal tightly in his hands, the pages still fluttering from the strange gust that had filled the room. "We're not leaving until we know what happened to the people who lived here," he insisted. "They made a pact with something. That's what the journal is saying. And it's not just a story, it's real." The others exchanged uneasy glances. Aina wanted to argue, to demand they leave before they became part of the house's tortured history, but something in Javier's tone stopped her. There was a determination in his eyes, a refusal to let the mystery remain unsolved. And despite the fear gnawing at her own stomach, she couldn't deny the curiosity that burned within her too. What had happened here? Why were they all drawn to this cursed place? With a reluctant sigh, Anna nodded. "Fine, but we don't stay long. I don't care what we find in there. Once we know, we leave. No more games." Together they made their way back inside, the door creaking shut behind them with a soft final thud. The temperature inside was colder than before, and the faint smell of decay seemed to have worsened, hanging in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. The shadows felt deeper, more oppressive, and every creak of the house made their hearts race faster. They passed the same rooms they had explored earlier, but the atmosphere felt different now, more hostile, more aware of their presence. Javier led them back to the study, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the old journal. "There has to be more in here," he muttered, flipping through the pages. We need to find out what happened to the family who lived here. Who were they, and what did they do to summon whatever that thing was? The journal's pages were brittle, the ink faded and barely legible in places. But as Javier flipped to a new section, the words became clearer. He began to read aloud, his voice low, almost reverent. The family who built this house, the Velasques, were wealthy, powerful, and well known in the region. But they were never content. They sought immortality, and they sought power beyond what any human could wield. Anna frowned, stepping closer to get a better look. Immortality? She asked, her voice incredulous. But that doesn't make sense. What could they have possibly done? Javier continued, ignoring her question. They came into contact with an entity, something ancient, something dark. They called it the Lord of the Abyss. It offered them everything they wanted: wealth, power, eternal life, in exchange for something simple: their souls. He paused, his eyes scanning the pages in disbelief. The pact was sealed with blood, and once it was made, they couldn't back out. David shuddered, his voice a whisper. That's insane. How could anyone be that desperate? To sell their soul for power? Javier didn't answer. He just continued reading, the words seeming to echo in the cold, silent room. But the Velasques made a terrible mistake. They believed the entity's promises, thinking they could control it, that they could benefit from the power without suffering its consequences. But in the end, the entity's true nature was far worse than they could have imagined. They were bound to the house, trapped in an endless cycle of torment, forced to relive their final moments of betrayal and despair. And anyone who enters the house becomes a part of their curse. The journal fell silent for a moment, its pages fluttering as though caught in an invisible breeze. The group stared at the words, each of them trying to process the horror of what they had just read. But the truth was clear now. The house was more than just haunted. It was a prison, a place where the souls of the Velasques and countless others who had dared to enter were trapped forever, bound by the pact they had made with the demon. We're not safe here, Anna said, her voice trembling. We need to leave. We're not just dealing with ghosts. We're dealing with something far worse. But Javier, despite the fear in his eyes, wasn't ready to give up. We have to break the curse, he said, his voice determined, though his hands shook as he gripped the journal. We have to find a way to undo the pact. If we don't, we'll be stuck here, just like the others, just like them. David looked at him, disbelief etched on his face. And how do we do that? How do we undo a deal with a demon? This isn't a movie, Javier. Javier didn't answer, his eyes scanning the journal for any clue that could help them. His mind was racing, desperate for an answer. But the truth was undeniable. If they didn't break the pact, they would be trapped here forever, forced to relive their own final moments, just like the family that had once lived in this cursed mansion. A sudden, sharp screech echoed from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. It was the same rhythmic sound they had heard before, but this time it was closer, much closer. Too late, Anna whispered, the realization settling in like a weight on her chest. Chapter 5. The Last Breath. The sound of footsteps echoed through the mansion again, but this time it was unmistakable. There was no mistaking the heavy, dragging sound of something or someone moving in the darkness. The temperature in the room plummeted further, and their breaths became visible in the cold air. Javier, still holding the journal, turned his head slowly, his eyes wide with a mix of dread and fascination. What the hell is that? David whispered, his voice strained. The sound grew louder, closer. The unmistakable shuffle of footsteps on the floorboards sent a shiver through his spine. He wasn't imagining it. They were no longer alone. Anna stepped back instinctively, her hand clasping David's. It's them, she said, her voice tight with fear. The spirits, the ones the journal talked about. The family, the ones who made the pact. As if on cue, the air shifted, a low, drawn-out wail filling the space around them. It was coming from above, the mournful cry of someone in agony. The sound seemed to vibrate through the walls, creeping into their very bones. It was as though the house itself was crying out, reliving the suffering of those long dead. Javier's face tightened. He had been determined to solve the mystery of the mansion, but now that the true horrors were unfolding before them, The weight of the truth hit him like a freight train. He had led his friends into a trap, a house filled with restless spirits, bound by a pact that couldn't be undone. Another scream echoed from upstairs, this one sharper, more desperate. It felt like it was tearing through the very fabric of the mansion. The group stood frozen, their senses overwhelmed by the noise, the cold, and the unseen presence pressing in on them. And then, from the corner of the room, a shape began to materialize in the dim light, a figure, faint at first, but growing clearer as the seconds ticked by. It was a woman. Her face was pale, gaunt, the skin stretched tight over her bones. Her hair, once rich and full, hung in matted strands around her face, as though it hadn't been tended to in years. She wore a torn, disheveled gown that hung loosely from her emaciated body, and her hands, her fingers, were long and skeletal, twitching as though trying to reach for something, someone. Anna gasped, stumbling back, her heart hammering in her chest. "Is that her?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Javier could barely speak, his eyes fixed on the ghostly woman. It's her. The mother. I think it's the matriarch of the Velasquez family. The one who made the pact." The woman's hollow eyes seemed to lock onto them, unblinking, and the temperature in the room dropped even further, each breath they took burning their lungs with the cold. A low, mournful sound filled the air again, a long, drawn-out sigh, as if the spirit was trying to speak, but no words came. Then, slowly, she raised one bony hand and pointed toward the hallway, her finger trembling as if in warning. Without a word, the woman's form began to fade, dissolving into the air like mist. But just before she vanished completely, a raspy voice broke through, barely more than a whisper. "The last breath is the one that binds. The pact can only be broken by the one who made it." The words sent a shiver of dread through the group. It was clear now this was no simple haunting. The Velasquez family had been cursed to repeat their last moments, bound forever by the pact they had made with the demon. But what did the spirit mean by the one who made it? Was it one of them who had to break the curse? "We need to get out of here," David said, panic creeping into his voice. This place is alive with the suffering of those who died here. They're trying to warn us. We're not supposed to be here." But before anyone could respond, another scream rang out. This one was louder, a high-pitched cry of desperation. The sound seemed to flood the room, its intensity drowning out everything else. The group spun around, their eyes wide with terror as they saw another figure, this time a man, appear at the far end of the room. He was taller than the woman, his body draped in tattered clothes that barely clung to his skeletal frame. His face was contorted in agony, his eyes sunken and black, his mouth open in a silent scream that could never be heard. He reached out with his arms, his fingers twisted in an unnatural way, and the group felt the temperature drop even further, their bodies freezing as though they had been plunged into an ice-cold river. "This isn't real," Javier said, but even his voice cracked. He wanted to believe it wasn't real, that it was all in their heads, but the cold and the terror surrounding them were all too real. He could feel the presence of the spirits, the weight of their pain, pressing down on him. Then, without warning, the man lunged forward, moving with unnatural speed. Javier barely had time to react as the figure grabbed him by the shoulders, his bony fingers digging into his skin with a strength that was impossible for something so frail. The man's face hovered close to his, eyes empty and hollow, his mouth twitching in what might have been a smile or a grimace. The cold seeped through Javier's clothes, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he felt his own breath stop, his heart freeze in his chest. "Javier!" Anna screamed, rushing forward, but the spirit released its grip just as quickly as it had attacked. It dissipated into nothingness, leaving the air thick with the scent of decay. Javier staggered backward, gasping for breath, his heart racing. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, clutching his chest. The spirit had nearly suffocated him, as if trying to drag him into the same fate as the family that had once lived here. "We need to break this," Javier said through gritted teeth, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to end this. Whatever the pact is, whatever it requires, we have to finish it, or we'll never leave." They stood in silence, the weight of the mansion's curse pressing down on them. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, but within the walls of the mansion, they felt nothing but the cold grip of death. Chapter 6. The Cycle of Suffering. The room had fallen into an eerie silence. The figures of the Velasquez family had vanished, leaving only the echo of their tortured wails lingering in the cold air. The group stood frozen, trying to catch their breath, their hearts still pounding from the terrifying encounter. But something felt wrong. The atmosphere, thick with dread, had shifted. It was as though the house itself had paused, holding its breath, waiting. Javier was the first to speak, his voice shaky but determined. "This isn't just a haunting. This is something else, something deeper." His words were met with uneasy silence as the others processed what had just happened. They weren't just seeing ghosts. They were being pulled into the very nightmare the mansion had trapped the Velasquez family in. David, his face pale and stricken, glanced toward the door. "I swear we were just standing here a minute ago." He looked at the others, his eyes wide with fear. It feels like we're in a loop, like the house is repeating itself." Anna shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. "That's not possible. We're just scared. We're imagining things. This can't be happening." But Javier wasn't so sure. His gaze shifted to the dark corners of the room, his eyes narrowing as though seeing something the others couldn't. "Number. It's not in our heads. We've seen this before. The voices, the footsteps, the shadows, everything. It's like we're living through the same thing over and over again." David's eyes widened in realization. "Wait, you're right. When we came in here before, the door was locked. But now, it's open." His voice was tight with panic as he moved toward the hallway. "We've been here before." The door in question creaked ominously as it swung open on its own, the heavy air of the mansion spilling into the room. The hallway outside looked the same as before, empty, silent, and unnervingly still. But when David stepped into the hallway, a chilling sensation washed over him, as though the house was aware of their every movement, tracking them with predatory patience. Anna stepped forward, her breath shallow. "How is this possible? How are we stuck here?" Javier clenched his fists, a sense of dread creeping through his veins. He knew what had happened. The mansion wasn't just haunted. It was trapped in a cycle, a temporal loop that repeated over and over, trapping anyone who entered in the same horror, forced to live through the same moments of terror again and again. "Just like the Velasquez family. We're reliving their last moments," Javier muttered. "Over and over again. Just like they did." Anna looked at him, horrified. "But if we're repeating this, then we're going to die, aren't we? Just like they did." Javier's eyes darkened. "If we don't break the cycle, yes, we'll never leave. This house, this curse, it's keeping us here." The walls of the mansion seemed to close in on them as the full weight of their predicament settled in. It wasn't just a ghostly presence they had to worry about. The very fabric of time itself was being manipulated. They were trapped in an endless loop, with no way of escaping unless they could find the key to breaking it. Suddenly, the door at the far end of the hallway slammed shut with a deafening bang, making them all jump. The sound reverberated throughout the mansion, as if the house was rejecting them, pushing them back into the cycle. It was clear now this wasn't just a place of torment. It was a prison, a place where the past could never be forgotten, where the suffering of the Velasquez family and anyone foolish enough to enter would be replayed for eternity. "Look," David said, his voice trembling as he pointed toward the door. The hallway beyond had shifted. What had once been a long, empty corridor now stretched out before them, its walls seeming to curve and bend unnaturally, as though the very architecture of the house was warping. Javier's gaze flicked to the shifting hallway, a sinking feeling settling in his stomach. "It's the cycle," he whispered. "It's resetting again. We're stuck in it." Anna's eyes darted nervously between her friends. "What can we do? How do we break out of this?" Javier opened the journal once more, scanning the pages feverishly, his fingers trembling as they traced the fading ink. "The pact. The key to breaking this curse is the pact. We need to find a way to undo it, find the one who made it, and make them take responsibility for what they've done. Only then can we break the cycle. But we need to do it fast. The house won't let us leave until we do." A heavy silence hung over them as they realized the magnitude of what lay ahead. There was no way out except through the curse itself. They had to find the family member who had made the pact with the demon, the one who had sealed their fate and condemned them all to this endless cycle of suffering. The floorboards creaked beneath them, and an unsettling breeze whispered through the hallway, carrying the faintest sound of a voice, like a whisper from another time, the last breath, the one who made the pact. Only they can end it. The voice was distant, fading like a dying ember, but the meaning was clear. They had to find the one responsible, or they would be trapped here forever. As they made their way down the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence, they felt the presence of the house grow stronger. It was as if the walls were closing in around them, the darkness pressing down from all sides, whispering that they would never escape. The cycle was repeating again. The house was watching, waiting for them to make their move. And time, if it even existed here, was running out. Chapter 7. The house comes to life. The hallway stretched before them, its walls pulsating with an unnatural rhythm, like the very heartbeat of the house. The air felt thicker now, heavier, pressing against them from all sides. Every step they took seemed to echo back at them, as if the house was reflecting their movements, anticipating them. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, watching, waiting, breathing. David's hand instinctively went to the wall beside him, fingers brushing against the cold, rough surface. But as he touched it, the sensation shifted beneath his fingers, something soft and wet. He recoiled, his stomach turning. The walls were no longer just stone and plaster. They were something else now, something alive. "What the hell?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. It's not the same anymore. The walls are changing." Javier, who had been leading the way, turned sharply at David's voice. "What do you mean? What's happening?" David looked at him, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I don't know. It's like the house is alive. It's breathing, pulsing. His words faltered as the walls around them seemed to groan, a low, guttural sound that came from deep within the mansion itself. The floor beneath their feet shifted, causing the group to stagger. It was as if the very foundation of the house had suddenly become unstable. The sound of grinding stone filled the air, as though the walls were slowly closing in on them, inch by inch, tightening the grip of the house around them. "We need to move," Anna urged, her voice tight with fear. It's trying to trap us. We need to get to the center of the house. If there's anything we can do, we need to find it now." But as they moved forward, the house seemed to anticipate their every step. The hallway, once a simple passage, now twisted and stretched like a living organism, warping as they walked. What had once been a straight path now branched off in multiple directions, each corridor leading them deeper into the maze of the mansion, further from any hope of escape. Javier's flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the shifting walls. Every time it dimmed, the darkness seemed to grow stronger, more oppressive. It wasn't just the ghosts now. The house itself was conspiring against them, manipulating the very space around them. The walls were closing in slowly, relentlessly. "Where are we?" David asked, his voice rising with panic. "This wasn't here before. We didn't pass this door." Anna glanced around, her breath catching in her throat. "It's like the house is changing itself. It's alive. It's reacting to us." A loud bang echoed from somewhere deep within the mansion, and the group froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. The noise sounded like something heavy falling, followed by the unmistakable creak of wood splintering. The house groaned in response, its very bones aching under the pressure of something unseen. "Move," Javier ordered, his voice tense as he grabbed Anna's arm and pulled her forward. They were losing precious time. The house was shifting, twisting, becoming more hostile with every passing moment. It was no longer a passive observer, it was a malevolent force, one that was actively trying to ensnare them, to consume them. As they turned a corner, a sharp, grinding sound echoed from above. They all looked up just in time to see the ceiling begin to split open, the cracks widening as though the very structure of the house was being torn apart. A thick black ooze began to seep through the cracks, dripping down in grotesque tendrils that stretched toward them like something alive, seeking to pull them into the walls. "What the hell is that?" Anna gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. This isn't just a house anymore. It's a trap." Javier's face was grim, his expression a mixture of disbelief and determination. The house is feeding on us. It wants us to be part of its cycle. We're not just trapped in time, we're trapped in it. The pact, it's still binding us. The walls seem to lurch, the floors buckling beneath their feet, causing them all to stagger. The house had become something else, something more than just a cursed structure. It was a living entity, a twisted, malevolent force that thrived on their fear and suffering. And it wasn't going to let them go without a fight. Javier pushed forward, his mind racing. There had to be a way to stop this. The Velasquez family had been the ones to open this door to hell. But the house was more than just their prison, it was the source of their torment. And now it had become the group's. But how could they fight something like this? How could they fight a house that was alive, that was aware of their every move? The floor beneath them shifted again, and the ceiling above groaned under the strain. They could feel the house pressing in on them, the walls closing in tighter, more suffocating with each passing second. It wasn't just the house that was alive, it was the curse itself, an endless loop of suffering that had been set in motion centuries ago. "We can't stop it," Anna said, her voice shaking. We're not going to make it." "No," Javier said firmly, his grip tightening around the journal he still clutched in his hand. "We will. We have to. This ends tonight." But even as he spoke, the house seemed to react. The walls groaned again, this time louder and more menacing, and the floor trembled beneath their feet as if the house itself was preparing to swallow them whole. Suddenly, the door at the end of the hallway slammed shut with a deafening crash. The group was trapped in the dark, suffocating maze, the house's pulse growing louder, the sound of its breathing filling their ears. And then, a voice low and guttural whispered from the darkness, "You are mine now." Chapter 8. The Necessary Sacrifice. The air grew colder as they pushed forward through the shifting maze of the house. It seemed to stretch infinitely before them, each turn leading to yet another dead end, each door opening to the same suffocating darkness. They had come to understand one horrifying truth: the house wasn't just a prison. It was a living, breathing entity that fed off their fear, their pain, and now their desperation. "We can't keep running like this," Anna gasped, her breath visible in the frigid air. "The house, it's closing in on us." Javier's face was set with determination, but even he could feel the weight of their situation pressing down on him. The walls were closing in, the floorboards beneath them warping and shifting, as though the very foundation of the mansion was alive, hungry for their suffering. They were running out of time, running out of options. "We need to find the heart of this place," Javier said through clenched teeth. "The source of the curse." The journal said something about a way to break it, but his voice faltered. "I don't know how. We've tried everything." David's voice was tight with fear. "What if there's no way out? What if we're meant to be here, just like them? The Velasquez family, maybe this is it. Maybe we're supposed to be a part of it now." "No," Anna replied quickly, shaking her head. "We can't think like that. We can't just give up. We can't let this place win." Javier turned his gaze toward her, his eyes full of grim resolve. "There's something we haven't considered. The pact. We know it's tied to the family, one of them made it. But there's something more. The house. It's feeding off us, yes, but it's also tied to the pact itself. To break it, we need to find out who made the ultimate choice, the one who sealed the fate of everyone trapped here." The words hung in the air like a heavy shroud, and the group fell silent, each of them contemplating the enormity of what they were up against. The Velasquez family had made a choice, a sacrifice, when they had entered into their dark pact. That was the source of their suffering. The house was a manifestation of that very choice, an eternal prison built on the backs of their greed and desperation. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled again, and the walls began to creak and groan as though they were alive, shifting in response to something. The temperature dropped even further, and the flickering light from their torches seemed to dim in the growing cold. The house was alive, and it was growing more aggressive. "We don't have much time," Javier said, his voice urgent. "I think I know what we need to do. We have to find the one who made the pact, the one who chose it. They have to undo it." Anna's eyes widened. "But how? How do we find them?" The journal didn't say who it was, just that they were cursed. Javier turned toward the dark corridor ahead. "We need to look for the room where it all started, the family study. There's something in there, something that will tell us who the one was. And once we know that, we'll have a choice." We'll have to decide what to do. David looked uncertain. And if we find them, what happens then? Javier hesitated. Then, we have to make a choice too. They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the hollow silence of the mansion, their breath shallow and quick. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and every corner of the house seemed to be watching them, waiting. The walls seemed to close in tighter with each passing second, as if the mansion itself was preparing for the endgame, drawing them all toward a final confrontation. When they reached the door to the family's study, it was locked, of course. The house had anticipated their move, as it had anticipated every move before. Javier took a deep breath, and then, with trembling hands, he pushed the door open. Inside, the room was as they had imagined it. Old books lined the shelves, the air thick with the scent of dust and forgotten history. In the center of the room stood a large desk, its surface cluttered with papers, faded maps, and a single tarnished object, a ring, engraved with a symbol they recognized. The same symbol found in the journal. The journal had mentioned the ring, but it hadn't explained its significance. Now, it was clear it was the key to understanding the pact. Javier reached for the ring, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. As soon as his skin made contact, the room around them seemed to shift, the walls groaning in protest, as though the house was reacting to the ring's presence. The temperature dropped even further, the air thick with the weight of something ancient, something evil. Anna looked at him, her eyes wide. What's happening? Javier didn't answer immediately. He was too focused on the ring. It felt heavy in his hand, as though it was pulling at him, drawing him deeper into the mansion's curse. And then, a voice soft but insistent whispered through his mind. To break the cycle, one must pay the price. A soul must be given. A sacrifice must be made. The words were unmistakable, as though they had come from the very walls themselves. Javier's heart raced as he understood the full weight of the decision before him. To break the curse, to free his friends, one of them had to die. The sacrifice had to come from within the group. One of them had to pay the price for the pact's undoing. The reality of the situation hit him like a wave, drowning him in the cold, suffocating understanding of what needed to be done. There was no escape without a price. The curse demanded it, and the house would not let them go without it. Ana, David, and Javier stood in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. The mansion seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as though it were drawing strength from their fear and indecision. They had reached the heart of the curse, and now the only question that remained was who would be the one to make the ultimate sacrifice. No, Ana said, shaking her head, her voice firm despite the fear that gripped her. We can't choose who dies. We're not doing this. Javier closed his eyes, his fingers still curled around the ring. We don't have a choice. We either sacrifice one of us, or we stay here forever. David looked between them, his face pale, his eyes full of dread. There has to be another way. We can't just... The house seemed to shudder in response, the walls groaning with an almost human-like intensity. The choice had been made, whether they liked it or not. The house had trapped them, and now it was offering its price. They were running out of time. Chapter 9. The battle with the darkness. The air was thick with a heavy, oppressive energy that seemed to press down on them from all sides. The mansion had shifted again, the hallways now narrower, the rooms more distorted. It was as though the very fabric of the house was tearing apart, warping under the weight of their impending decision. The walls pulsated with a low hum, and the temperature had dropped to a bone-chilling cold, the atmosphere thick with dread. Javier clutched the cursed ring tightly in his hand, the weight of the decision gnawing at him. The house had made its demands clear, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the true horror wasn't just in the sacrifice, it was in the demon that controlled this place. They weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting to survive against something far older and more powerful than they could possibly understand. We have to find it, Javier said, his voice sharp with resolve. The demon, the one who's controlling all of this. If we can destroy it, maybe we can break the cycle for good. David and Anna exchanged uncertain glances. The fear in their eyes was palpable, but they knew the truth. There was no other choice. The curse had to end, and the demon had to be stopped. The house, once a passive observer, had become a weapon, and it was clear that it was trying to keep them from finding the source of its power. The walls seemed to respond to their words, groaning in response, the sound reverberating through the house like the growl of some unseen creature. The mansion itself seemed to be alive now, its very structure reacting to their movements, shifting and reshaping in ways that defied logic. It was no longer just a building, it was an extension of the demon's will, a living prison designed to keep them trapped. "This place is trying to kill us," Anna whispered, her voice shaking as she took a cautious step forward. "Every step we take is like stepping deeper into its maw." Javier nodded grimly. "Exactly. And we're running out of time. We need to destroy the demon, or none of us will make it out alive." They moved forward, their footsteps echoing eerily in the suffocating silence, their eyes darting around as if expecting the walls to close in on them at any moment. The mansion seemed to warp with every step they took. What had once been a clear path now twisted in impossible angles. Doors that had been open now slammed shut, and the darkness around them deepened, pressing in on them with crushing intensity. As they reached the grand staircase, the air grew colder, and a low rumble echoed from the floors beneath them. The ground beneath their feet shifted violently, and they were thrown off balance as the entire mansion seemed to tremble. The house itself was reacting to their proximity to the source, and the demon was stirring, awakening from its long slumber. In the distance, a deep, guttural laugh echoed through the halls, sending a wave of cold terror washing over them. The sound was inhuman, dark, and twisted, and it seemed to come from every direction at once. It was the laugh of something ancient, something evil, and it was now aware of their presence. "You're too late," the voice boomed, its tone dripping with malice. It was everywhere, inside their minds, in the very walls of the house. "This house is mine. You cannot escape. You will all suffer as those before you have suffered, and your souls will belong to me." The group's hearts raced, but Javier didn't hesitate. He knew the only way to end this was to face it head on. "We're not afraid of you," he shouted, his voice defiant. "We're breaking this curse, and we're going to end you." The laugh grew louder, more distorted, until it became a deafening roar. The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, and suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness. The lights from their torches flickered and died, leaving them in absolute blackness. A cold, damp wind rushed through the room, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay and death. "We're not alone," David said, his voice barely audible in the darkness. He could feel something moving in the air around them, something malevolent, something hungry. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and his pulse quickened. "Stay close," Javier ordered. His heart was pounding, but he knew they had to keep moving. "We're going to find the demon. We have to destroy it." Suddenly, a piercing scream echoed through the house, the sound of someone or something suffering in unimaginable agony. The walls shifted again, and the house seemed to close in on them as if it were alive, its pulse growing faster, stronger. The very air around them seemed to throb with dark energy, and the pressure was becoming unbearable. The ground trembled beneath them, and then suddenly, without warning, the entire floor beneath them collapsed. The group screamed as they fell, their bodies plunging into the abyss below. They landed with a sickening thud in a dark, cavernous room. The walls of this new chamber were slick with something dark and viscous, and the air reeked of rot. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form shrouded in darkness. It was tall, impossibly tall, its features hidden beneath a hooded cloak made of shadow itself. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its smile was twisted, filled with a malevolent hunger that sent shivers down their spines. "I am the one who binds this house to the suffering of the living," the demon growled, its voice low and guttural. "I am the one who controls this place, and now you will be part of my collection." Javier didn't hesitate. With a fierce shout, he lunged at the demon, brandishing the cursed ring. The demon's laughter echoed in the chamber as it raised a hand, and the very shadows seemed to stretch and twist, reaching out to bind them. But just before the darkness could take hold, the ring glowed with a bright, blinding light, pushing back the shadows, forcing them to retreat. "No," the demon roared, its voice tinged with fear for the first time. "You cannot defeat me." "You," Javier reached out, placing the ring on the demon's chest. And as he did, the mansion itself seemed to shake violently, as though the very foundations of the house were being torn apart. The light from the ring blazed, flooding the room with a blinding brilliance that overwhelmed the darkness. With a final deafening scream, the demon was torn apart, its body disintegrating into ash, and the mansion itself seemed to collapse, the walls crumbling, the shadows evaporating. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and for the first time since entering, the house fell silent. But as the dust settled, the group stood in the ruins of the mansion, breathing heavily. The curse had been broken. The cycle had ended. They had defeated the darkness. Chapter 10. The Last Sigh. The dust settled around them, thick and suffocating, the remnants of the mansion's collapse hanging heavy in the air. The oppressive darkness that had consumed them for so long had finally lifted, but the silence that followed was even more deafening. The mansion, once alive with its twisted pulse, now lay still, its walls crumbling to dust, its shadows dissipating into nothingness. The demon was gone, but the price of its defeat was a bitter one. Javier, Ana, and David stood amidst the ruins, their faces pale, their bodies bruised and battered from the violent battle. The ring, which had been their only hope, now lay shattered on the ground, its glow extinguished. They were free. Or so they thought. Javier's breath was ragged as he glanced at his friends, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what they had just experienced. "We did it," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "We stopped it." Ana nodded, though her eyes were distant. But at what cost? Her voice trembled as she looked around at the destruction. "The house is gone, but we're not the same. We can't be." David, his hands trembling as he wiped away dirt from his face, let out a low laugh that held no humor. "We're alive. That's the only thing that matters." But the words felt hollow, as if the victory had come at the cost of something deeper, something they couldn't name. The house may have fallen, but the curse, it had left its mark on them all. The fear, the suffering, the knowledge of the horror they had witnessed it, was a weight they would carry forever. Javier stepped forward, his eyes scanning the remnants of the mansion, but all he saw now was emptiness. The house had been consumed by its own evil, and with it, the terrible memories of the Velasquez family and the demon that had once held them captive. The mansion was no more. It had collapsed into ruins, as if it had never existed. Yet the lingering sense of dread gnawed at him, as if the house was still watching, still waiting. Suddenly the wind picked up, blowing through the broken windows, the sound of it almost mournful. Ana shivered as the chill swept through her. It was like a final breath, a sigh that seemed to come from the very bones of the house itself. The wind carried with it an unmistakable presence, as though the mansion had one last thing to say, a final warning. Javier turned to face his friends. "We need to leave," he said urgently. Now, before he could finish his sentence, a sudden, sharp pain exploded in his chest. He staggered backward, his hand clutching at his heart. The others froze, their eyes wide with shock and fear as they watched him fall to his knees. "What's happening?" Ana screamed, rushing to his side. "Javier, what's wrong?" Javier's face twisted in pain, his breathing shallow. It's still here," he gasped, his voice barely audible. "The curse. It's not gone. It's in me. It's in all of us." David reached out, trying to help him, but a strange, dark shadow seemed to wrap around Javier's form, as though the mansion's malevolent presence was still clinging to him. His body trembled, and his eyes rolled back, as if some unseen force were dragging him deeper into the abyss. "No!" Ana cried out, tears streaming down her face. "We broke the curse. We defeated the demon. This can't be happening." Javier's lips parted in a final, tortured gasp. You don't understand the house. It never leaves." His voice trailed off, his eyes locking onto Anna's with an expression of pure terror. The ground beneath them trembled, and the air seemed to grow even colder. The wind howled through the ruins, a low, mournful wail that filled the air with the echoes of the past. The darkness that had once consumed the mansion was now seeping into them, creeping into their hearts, into their souls. Javier's body convulsed one last time before going still, his eyes fixed in a vacant, lifeless stare. Ana screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the wind. David stood frozen, unable to move, his heart pounding in his chest as he looked at his friend's lifeless body. The mansion, though now reduced to rubble, had not let go of them. Its curse had been broken in one sense, but in another, it had transferred to them. Javier had been the one to bear the brunt of the sacrifice, but now, in his death, something far darker had been unleashed. The house's presence had not been confined to the walls, it had seeped into their very being. Ana fell to her knees beside Javier's body, her hands trembling as she touched his cold skin. "What do we do now?" she whispered, her voice broken. David, his mind spinning with horror and disbelief, could only shake his head. I don't know. But as they sat there, surrounded by the ruins of the mansion, the wind seemed to carry with it an unmistakable voice, a whisper that echoed through the emptiness. One last breath, one last sigh. Your torment is not over. You are mine, forever. And with that, the wind died down, leaving the two survivors alone in the ruins. But they knew deep down, they knew that the mansion's curse had not ended. It had simply taken a new form, a new vessel, and they too would never be free of its grip. The spell of eternal night. Chapter 1. The arrival in the village Sofia had always dreamed of escaping the noise and chaos of the city, but the quiet isolation of the small mountain village they moved to was far from what she had imagined. As the car drove deeper into the winding forest roads, the air grew thicker, colder. The sun, once bright in the morning sky, seemed to disappear behind a heavy curtain of clouds that hung unnaturally low. Her father, eager to start fresh, didn't seem to notice the strange atmosphere. He was too focused on the future, the new house, the new life. But Sofia could feel something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as if the very land was watching them. The village itself appeared like a ghost of another timestone cottages with moss-covered roofs, narrow streets lined with crooked lampposts that flickered even in the middle of the day. Yet no matter where Sofia looked, she could see no one outside. It was as though the village was empty, or worse, frozen in time. Even the wind, which should have whispered through the trees, seemed to avoid the village, leaving it eerily still. Her father, oblivious to the strange silence, carried on as if they had just arrived at any other normal place. But Sofia couldn't shake the sense that something watched from the shadows. As the family made their way up to their new home, a large, old manor perched on the edge of the village, Sofia's eyes caught glimpses of figures in the windows of nearby cottages. Their faces were pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow, like the living dead. They didn't wave or greet them. Instead, they stared. Sofia felt a chill crawl down her spine. She looked away quickly, focusing on the path ahead, but her heart raced. The air here felt thick, suffocating, as if every breath she took was heavier than the last. The house they were to stay in, an old manor that had seen better days, sat at the edge of the village, right where the forest began to close in. Tall trees with gnarled branches arched over the road leading to it, casting long, crooked shadows that seemed to move on their own. The house itself looked abandoned, as if time had forgotten it. Its windows were dark, its stone walls cracked and weathered, and the front door creaked eerily in the wind. Sofia felt her stomach twist as they stepped inside. Her mother, trying to make the best of things, forced a smile as she unpacked their things. Sofia, however, couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every room she entered felt cold, too cold for a house that should have been welcoming. There were no warm lights, no comfortable warmth of home, only a biting chill that crept into her bones. She wandered through the rooms, feeling as if she were intruding on something ancient, something long forgotten. The air seemed to hum with an odd, oppressive energy, and the silence was so thick it pressed against her chest. The first night was the hardest. As she lay in bed, Sofia couldn't sleep. The darkness outside her window wasn't like the usual nightfall. It felt unnatural, almost suffocating. It was as if the night had no end, no promise of the dawn. A strange, unspoken weight hung over the village, and she could hear distant sounds in the dark, whispers carried by the wind that weren't quite human. She got up, tiptoeing to the window, and peered out. The village, under the moonlight, seemed like a frozen portrait, its shadows stretching far too long, as if the darkness itself was alive, reaching. The next morning, Sofia ventured outside in search of answers. She passed by the stone cottages again, trying to find someone who might speak to her. She approached an elderly woman sitting on the porch of one of the houses, knitting slowly, her hands trembling as they moved through the yarn. Her eyes, however, were fixed on Sophia, sharp and unnerving. "You shouldn't be here," the old woman said in a voice that sent a shiver down Sophia's spine. "The night never ends here, child. And neither does the waiting." Sophia smiled politely, unsure of how to respond, but the woman's words stuck with her. The waiting? What was she talking about? She asked more questions, but the woman refused to answer, her gaze turning hollow, lost in the distance. Sophia turned to leave, but just as she did, the old woman's voice cut through the air, her tone cold and final. "Don't look for the truth. You may not like what you find." The warning echoed in Sophia's mind as she walked away, a sense of dread settling over her heart. The villagers, when Sophia tried to speak to them, were all similarly distant, evasive. They never spoke of the sun, nor of the long nights that stretched on without end. It was as if the darkness was a normal part of their lives, something they had long since accepted. But Sophia knew something was wrong. No place should be shrouded in eternal night. No place should feel as though time had stopped, as though life itself had been trapped in a suspended moment. She began to sense that there was a secret buried deep in the village, one that nobody dared speak of. By the end of the week, Sophia could no longer ignore the strange pull to the forest that surrounded the village. It called to her in the quiet hours, the whispers in the wind beckoning her. There was something about the ancient trees, their twisted roots and dark branches, that felt familiar, almost as if they were waiting for her too, but she resisted. The last thing she wanted was to delve deeper into this oppressive mystery, especially when every instinct screamed at her to leave. But somehow, she knew it wasn't that simple. The village was holding her captive, and as much as she hated to admit it, she was already beginning to feel its grip tightening. Chapter 2. Whispers of the past. Sophia couldn't shake the words of the old woman from her mind. "Don't look for the truth. You may not like what you find." They echoed in her thoughts, swirling like the ever-present shadows in the village. Despite her unease, she couldn't help but feel that there was something important she was missing, some thread that tied the village's strange curse to her very being. The oppressive atmosphere of the village had a way of creeping into her thoughts, and each night, as the darkness closed in, it was as if the village itself was whispering, telling its secrets. In her search for answers, Sophia began speaking to the few villagers who were brave enough to leave their homes during the day. They all spoke of the village's history in hushed tones, as if even mentioning the past could stir something dark and dangerous. The older villagers spoke of a time long ago when the sun still ruled the sky. They remembered days filled with warmth, laughter, and the smell of fresh bread baking. But that all changed centuries ago, they said, when a woman named Esmeralda came to the village, a stranger, who wore a veil over her face, and whose eyes glowed unnaturally in the dark. Sophia's curiosity grew, but the more she asked, the more the villagers grew silent, their eyes darting nervously to the shadows around them. One morning, she overheard two elderly men talking in the town square, their voices low and urgent. "The curse is tied to her blood," one man said, glancing around as if to make sure no one else could hear. "The blood of the one who dared make a pact with the demon. We can never escape it, never, not while she is alive." Sophia's pulse quickened. Her blood? The words hit her like a thunderclap, and she couldn't help but feel a sinking feeling in her stomach. She knew she needed to know more, no matter the cost. That afternoon, Sophia visited the village's small library, an old, dusty building that smelled of mothballs and forgotten history. There, in the back corner, she found a collection of journals and books on local history, most of them neglected and half decayed. Among the worn pages, one book caught her attention, The Dark History of Esmeralda. As she flipped through the pages, Sophia found stories of the witch, of her beauty, her power, and of the pact she had made with the demon to ensure her place in history. Esmeralda had been a woman of great ambition, willing to do anything to achieve power. It was said that she had called upon the demon of the eternal night to grant her control over the sun itself. In return, she would give him her soul and the souls of all who lived in the village. Sophia's hands trembled as she read the final words of the book. And so the sun was sealed away forever, locked behind a veil of darkness that would never lift. For Esmeralda's bloodline would rule the cursed night for eternity. The words burned into her mind, a bitter truth she wasn't ready to face. She slammed the book shut, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a cold sweat break out on her skin. Her ancestors, had they been involved in this curse too? Was she part of this dark history? Determined to uncover the truth, Sophia began searching through the village's records, hoping to find a link between her family and the witch's bloodline. Days passed, and the deeper she dug, the more her doubts turned into certainty. Her family's name had appeared in the village records for centuries, tied to the oldest buildings, the ancient family crest. Her great-great-grandmother had once been the village's midwife, a position of some importance. But there were no records of what had happened to her, only that her line had been linked to Esmeralda's, her blood mingling with the witches. The more Sophia uncovered, the more she realized that the village's past wasn't just history, it was a living nightmare that had been passed down through generations. The people in the village weren't just living under a curse, they were prisoners, trapped in the endless night by Esmeralda's dark deal. And her own bloodline, it seemed, had been cursed to maintain the enchantment, ensuring that no one would ever be free. But why had her family never spoken of this? Why hadn't they warned her? One evening, as the sky grew darker earlier than usual, Sophia decided to confront the villagers about what she had learned. She gathered her courage and went to the town square, where a few of them had gathered around a small fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. They fell silent when they saw her approach, their eyes wary and reluctant. She took a deep breath and asked them directly, "What is the connection between my family and Esmeralda?" The oldest man in the group, a man who looked as though he had lived longer than the village itself, spoke at last. His voice was thick with sorrow, his words slow and heavy. "You don't know, do you?" he murmured. "The curse runs through your veins, child. It's been passed down through your family, always tied to the witch, always tied to her pact. It's not just the darkness that keeps you here. It's your blood. Your very existence is part of the curse." Sophia felt her knees weaken. She could barely breathe as the weight of his words crushed her. The villagers, once so distant, now looked at her with a mix of pity and fear. They knew the truth, and they were afraid of her. Afraid of what she might do with that knowledge. That night, Sophia couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning with the horror of what she had learned. She could feel the dark presence of the curse all around her, pressing in on her from every corner. Her bloodline was entwined with Esmeralda's, tied to the witch's dark deal with the demon. But what did that mean for her? Was she destined to become like Esmeralda, to be consumed by the darkness, or could she somehow break free? Sophia didn't know the answers yet, but she knew one thing for certain. The village's secret was now her secret, and she could never go back to the life she had before. Chapter 3. The first encounter with the witch the next morning, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that the village was closing in on her. She had learned too much, too quickly, and now the oppressive weight of the curse seemed to follow her every step. Even as she moved through the cobblestone streets, it felt as though the shadows themselves were watching her. They stretched unnaturally long and twisted in ways that defied reason. It wasn't just the darkness that haunted the village, it was something else, a presence, a force, and it was waiting for her. She couldn't stay in the library any longer, and the villagers were no help. They had spoken in riddles and whispers, but had never truly told her what she needed to know. No one would give her answers, not until she spoke to Esmeralda herself. But how? How could she confront a ghost, a legend wrapped in centuries of darkness, a witch whose name had become a curse, whose power was said to eclipse that of any living being? On the third night of her restless search, Sophia ventured into the forest. The trees, ancient and gnarled, seemed to shift and breathe around her as if alive, their limbs reaching out like twisted fingers. She felt an almost magnetic pull to the heart of the woods, where the air grew colder and the darkness grew thicker. She didn't know why she went, but some part of her knew she had to. The forest held answers. She was certain of it. The wind howled through the branches, as though urging her forward, and Sophia's heart pounded in her chest, but she could not turn back. As she ventured deeper, the familiar path she had walked during the day vanished. The dense fog rolled in, clinging to the ground like a living thing. Her breath quickened, her pulse racing as the weight of the darkness seemed to press on her from every direction. In the distance, She saw a flicker of movement, a figure. Someone or something was watching her from the trees. Sophia froze, every instinct telling her to run, but the strange pull kept her rooted to the spot. It was then that she heard the voice. It was soft at first, almost a whisper on the wind, but it grew louder, more insistent, as if the very forest itself was speaking to her. Sophia. The voice was sweet, yet filled with an undertone of malice, as though it knew things she didn't. It called her name again, this time from deeper within the forest. Without thinking, she moved towards it, the dark trees parting in front of her like an invitation. The closer she got, the more her heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't sure whether she was walking toward her salvation or toward her doom. And then she saw her. The woman standing before her was as much a part of the darkness as the trees themselves. Her long black hair flowed like tendrils of smoke, and her eyes glowed an unnatural, fiery red. Her face was beautiful, but pale and haunting, as if it belonged to something other than this world. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. This was Esmeralda the witch, the source of the curse that had haunted the village for centuries. Ah, Sophia, Esmeralda purred, her voice like velvet, yet sharp with malice. I've been waiting for you. Her lips curled into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The bloodline always finds its way back to me. It always does. Sophia stepped back, feeling her legs weaken beneath her. You did this. You cursed the village and my family. Her voice trembled, but she couldn't stop herself from speaking. Why? Why is my family tied to this? What do you want from me? Esmeralda's smile widened. What do I want? She mused, tilting her head as if Sophia were a curious little animal she was studying. I want what was promised to me. Power, control over life and death, over light and dark. Her eyes gleamed as she took a slow step forward, as if savoring Sophia's fear. Your bloodline is mine, just as it was your ancestors. The pact is a chain, child, one that binds you to me and to this eternal night. You cannot break it. You cannot escape it. Sophia's heart raced in her chest. She had heard the stories, but seeing the witch, feeling her presence, was something far more terrifying than anything she could have imagined. Every instinct in her screamed to run, but her legs felt like lead. Her mind was flooded with questions, but the words that came out were only one. How do I stop this? How do I end it? Esmeralda laughed softly, a sound that seemed to echo through the trees. You cannot. The sun will never rise again as long as the curse lives on, and it lives on in you, in your blood, in the blood of every one of your ancestors who made that fateful choice. There is no way out, Sophia, not for you, not for anyone. Sophia's mind raced. Then why did you bring me here? Why show me all of this? She demanded, her voice rising. Why tell me these things if there's nothing I can do? Esmeralda's smile faded into something more sinister. Because, little one, I wanted you to understand. I wanted you to see the futility of it all, to feel the weight of the darkness that has consumed you. She stepped closer, her presence overwhelming, as though the very air around them thickened. You will see soon enough, Sophia. You will see that this curse is not just my making, it is your inheritance, and you will carry it for as long as you breathe. Sophia felt her legs tremble, but she stood her ground. She could feel the darkness closing in around her, but something in her, something deep inside, refused to succumb. I will stop you, she whispered, though she wasn't sure whether she believed her own words. But the moment she spoke, a deep laugh filled the air, as if Esmeralda knew the truth Sophia had yet to accept. There was no escaping the night. Chapter 4. The Connection of Blood. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a dim, silver light that seemed to twist and contort as if the very heavens were in turmoil. Sophia stumbled back from the witch, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had never been so terrified in her life, yet beneath the fear, there was something else, something darker that she couldn't yet understand. A pull, an undeniable force that seemed to reach out from the depths of her blood, linking her to the curse in ways she had never imagined. Esmeralda's words still echoed in her mind, wrapping around her thoughts like chains. Your bloodline is mine. You will carry the curse for as long as you breathe. The more Sophia thought about them, the more the truth seemed to sink into her bones. It wasn't just that she was connected to Esmeralda's dark magic, it was that she was the key to the curse itself. She could feel it now, deep within her, as though something ancient was waking inside of her, stirring to life. Sophia ran through the forest, her heart racing as the witch's words chased her through the trees. The path seemed to twist and change before her eyes, as though the very forest itself was mocking her, guiding her toward some inevitable fate. Her mind was reeling, struggling to make sense of everything. Her blood was tied to the witch. Yes, but why? Why had her ancestors made such a terrible choice? And what did this mean for her now? She arrived at the old manor, her breath shallow, her mind a whirl of confusion and dread. The house, so familiar, now seemed like a prison. As she entered, the oppressive cold wrapped itself around her, seeping into her skin, numbing her thoughts. She felt something in the air, the weight of the curse pressing down, making it hard to breathe. It was as if the very walls were alive, watching her, waiting. The silence was deafening, and Sophia couldn't help but feel as though she were being swallowed whole by the shadows that stretched across the rooms. Her first instinct was to run, to leave, to escape the horrors she had uncovered. But there was no escaping this. The curse was inside her now. She could feel it, stirring like a beast trapped beneath her skin, a constant reminder that she was bound to the witch's will. She needed answers, and the only way to get them was to face what she had feared most, the truth of her blood. She retreated to the library, searching through the books and ancient scrolls she had gathered. She needed to know more about the curse, about Esmeralda's power, and the link between her family and the witch. The air around her felt thick with tension, and as she flipped through the pages of a long-forgotten journal, something caught her eye. A single name, scrawled in blood-red ink, "The Price of the Pact." It was a title, but more than that, it was a warning. Sophia's hands trembled as she read the words. The pact that Esmeralda had made with the demon had come at a terrible price, not only for the witch, but for anyone whose blood was touched by it. The curse wasn't just a shadow that had fallen over the village. It was a living, breathing entity that fed on the souls of those bound to it. The people of the village were slaves to the darkness, their lives stretching out in eternal torment, and the price of their freedom had already been paid. The soul of the firstborn of each generation of the cursed bloodline. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized the horrific truth. The firstborn. She was the firstborn in her family. That meant the price for breaking the curse was her life, her very soul. The terror that gripped her was unbearable, yet she couldn't tear herself away from the journal's pages. The words were clear. There was no way to break the curse without offering a life taken in exchange for the sun to return. Sophia sat back, her mind reeling as the weight of the revelation settled into her chest. The villagers had never told her the truth, because they were too afraid, too bound to the curse themselves, but she couldn't ignore it anymore. The darkness was suffocating, and she could feel its tendrils creeping closer, wrapping around her, pulling her into its depths. The witch's power, the demon's control, it was all tied to her. It was her blood that had to be spilled to free the village, to break the chains that had bound it for centuries. But could she do it? Could she sacrifice herself, her life, to save them all? The thought of it was almost too much to bear, and yet deep down she felt that she was the only one who could. No one else could make that choice. She was the last hope, the last thread of a broken legacy. She was the key to the curse, and perhaps, in the end, she was also the only way to destroy it. Sophia sat in the quiet, surrounded by the weight of the past and the certainty of her fate. The village had been lost to the darkness for too long, and if there was any hope of freeing it, she would have to face the witch once more. But this time, it wouldn't be about running or hiding. It would be about confronting the curse head-on. It would be about offering up her life to the very forces that had torn her world apart. She didn't know if she had the strength, the courage to go through with it, but she knew one thing: there was no turning back. Chapter 5. The Search for the Cursed Tom. The weight of her discovery clung to Sophia like a suffocating fog, and the walls of her home, once a place of safety, now felt like the confines of a tomb. Every creak of the old floorboards sent a shiver through her spine, and every shadow that stretched across the rooms seemed to whisper her name in the voice of the witch. Esmeralda's words replayed in her mind. Your bloodline is mine, and you will carry the curse for as long as you breathe. It felt like the very earth beneath her was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. Despite the terror gnawing at her, there was a singular burning thought that refused to die. There had to be a way to break the curse, a way to undo the pact. She couldn't know. She wouldn't accept that her only choice was to die in order to free the village. She wasn't ready to give in, to surrender to the darkness that had stolen the light of the sun and bound her family to this hellish fate. If there was any shred of hope left, she would find it, no matter how far she had to go or how deep she had to dig. The journal had given her some answers, but not enough. It had spoken of the cursed bloodline, of the demon's grip on the village, and the price of the pact, but it offered no solution, no way to reverse the curse. Sophia needed something more, something specific, a ritual, a spell, a powerful artifact, anything that could sever the chain that bound her to Esmeralda's dark legacy. Her only hope lay in the cursed tome mentioned in the ancient texts, the Grimoire of Eternal Night, the book that contained the original spell of the pact. It was said to be hidden somewhere in the village, protected by layers of magic so old and dark that no one had dared seek it for centuries. As the days passed, Sophia scoured the village, asking the elders for any clues, any fragment of information that might lead her to the book. But they were reluctant to speak, each one fearing what the knowledge could do to her. They had all long accepted their fate, some more willingly than others, but none of them wanted to risk awakening the curse further. The grimoire is lost to time, one of the oldest villagers had said. No one has ever found it, and it is better left undisturbed. The witch's magic is too powerful for any mortal to challenge. But Sophia's resolve only grew stronger with every word of warning. She couldn't let fear decide her fate. She couldn't let the village suffer for another 100 years in the eternal night. The book was out there, somewhere. It had to be. And she would find it, no matter the cost. Her search led her to the village's abandoned church, a crumbling relic at the edge of town. Its stone walls were covered in vines, and the stained glass windows had long been shattered. The church had been empty for decades, but Sophia had heard rumors from the older villagers. They said it had once been the site of rituals, ceremonies, and offerings to the demon, the dark force, that had cursed them all. If there was any place where the book could be hidden, it would be here. The church was the heart of the curse, the place where the pact had been sealed all those years ago. Sophia pushed open the heavy wooden doors with a creak that echoed through the hollow interior. The smell of mildew and decay filled her nostrils, and the floor beneath her feet groaned as if the church itself were alive, groaning under the weight of the years. As she walked deeper into the church, the air grew heavier, thick with the presence of the curse that still lingered. The altar at the front of the church was covered in dust, and the pews were in disrepair, their wood rotting away in the damp air. At the back of the church, hidden behind a collapsed wall, Sophia discovered a narrow stairwell leading down into the darkness. Her pulse quickened as she descended, the faint light of her lantern casting eerie shadows on the stone walls. She had been here before, many times, but never with the intent to uncover something as dangerous as this. The deeper she went, the colder the air became, as if the very ground beneath her feet was frozen in time, waiting for someone to awaken it. The stairwell opened up into a large underground chamber. In the center of the room was a stone pedestal, and on top of it lay an ancient, weathered book, the Grimoire of Eternal Night. Its cover was black as coal, embossed with symbols that pulsed faintly with dark energy. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, she hesitated. The book seemed to call to her, its power unmistakable, and its mere presence filled the chamber with an unsettling hum. She approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. She had seen the dangers the book held, its dark magic, the way it had consumed those who had sought it in the past. But she couldn't afford to be afraid anymore. Not now. If this book was the key to breaking the curse, she had to take it. There was no other way. As her fingers brushed against the cover, a sharp, cold wind rushed through the chamber, snuffing out her lantern. The room plunged into darkness, and for a moment, she thought she heard a voice, a low, guttural whisper, like the wind through a keyhole. "You should not have come, Sophia." The voice sent a chill through her spine, but she refused to back down. This was it. This was the moment that could change everything. She pulled the book from its pedestal, feeling the weight of its power settle into her hands like an anchor. The moment her fingers made contact with the pages, the air around her thickened, and the ground beneath her seemed to pulse with a dark rhythm. The curse had been disturbed. The chamber trembled, and for a moment, Sophia wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. But then she heard the sound of something cracking, breaking like chains being shattered. The book had begun to open on its own, the pages flipping as if propelled by an unseen force. Her heart raced. Whatever was inside this book, whatever spell it contained, was about to reveal itself. And Sophia knew deep down that the path she had chosen was about to change her life forever. Chapter 6. The Cursed Pages. The chamber was silent, save for the faint, eerie rustling of the book's pages, as though it were alive, breathing in the darkness. Sophia's hands trembled as she held the grimoire of eternal night, her heart pounding in her chest. The moment her fingers had touched the ancient tome, the world around her seemed to shift. Everything felt heavier, as though the very air was thick with something dark and ancient. And the voice, she had heard it, a whisper at the edge of her consciousness, growing louder now that she had disturbed the book. "You should not have come, Sophia," the voice whispered again. But this time, it wasn't just a distant echo. It was closer, inside her mind. It was the voice of the demon, the one who had made the pact with Esmeralda all those years ago, the force that had cursed her family and the village. The very air around her seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, as if the demon was awakening, stirring to life. Her grip tightened on the book, and she forced herself to take a step back, though the weight of it in her hands felt like an anchor, drawing her deeper into the darkness. The pages began to turn on their own, flipping rapidly as if they were searching for something, or perhaps as though the book were waiting for her to read it. The words on the pages seemed to shimmer and shift as though alive, each sentence written in blood-red ink that seemed to burn with an unnatural glow. And then, as she stared at the pages, Sophia realized with a jolt that the words were not Latin or any other language she had seen before. They were a language older than time itself, a language that carried the weight of curses, of spells that could bend reality, reshape destiny, and tear apart the very fabric of the world. She knew she shouldn't read them. She knew it was a mistake to let the book consume her, but she couldn't stop herself. The words called to her, promising answers, offering power, power to break the curse, to end the eternal night, to free the village. It was too much to resist, and with a trembling breath, Sophia began to read. The moment the first word crossed her lips, a dark wind filled the chamber, howling like a storm trapped within the walls. The temperature plummeted, and Sophia felt the icy tendrils of something ancient wrap around her, seeping into her very bones. The pages of the grimoire seemed to glow with an intensity that blinded her, and she could feel the power of the demon, the force that had been sealed in this book, rise within her. It was like a fire, consuming her from the inside, yet cold as death. She could hear the whispers of the demon in her mind now, louder, more insistent. "You think you can break the curse?" the voice mocked. "You think you can challenge me, child? I am the one who binds you. I am the reason you walk in shadows. Your bloodline is mine, and no spell will ever undo what has been done. No one can escape the night, not even you." Sophia gasped, her throat tightening as she tried to swallow the fear that threatened to choke her. The demon was in her mind, pulling at her very soul. But there was something else beneath the fear, something else rising inside her, a dark power, like a flame, that she could feel beginning to burn within her own blood. She had touched the grimoire, and now its magic had found her, its darkness entwining with her own. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she knew one thing: the demon was not just in the book, it was inside her now. The chamber around her began to distort, the walls shifting, the floor warping beneath her feet. The symbols on the grimoire pulsed with a life of their own, lighting up the room in an eerie, sickly glow. Sophia's vision blurred, and she could feel herself losing control, slipping away into the darkness that surrounded her. The demon's grip was tightening, and the more she read, the more she felt herself being consumed by it. But even as the fear clawed at her, she couldn't stop. The book had a hold on her now, and there was no turning back. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through her chest. Sophia gasped, dropping the grimoire as she clutched her heart. It felt like something was tearing at her from the inside, something violent and unrelenting. She collapsed to her knees, the pain radiating outward, consuming her. The demon's laughter echoed in her mind, and she heard it clearly now, as though it was standing right beside her. "You belong to me," it hissed, its voice like ice scraping against bone. "You are my vessel, my servant. Your bloodline always was." Her head spun, and for a moment, Sophia thought she might lose consciousness. But through the pain, something else emerged, a flicker of her own will, a defiance against the demon's control. She couldn't let it consume her. Not like this. Not now. She fought to clear her mind, to focus through the agony, to push the demon's influence away. With all the strength she had left, Sophia crawled toward the grimoire, and with trembling hands, slammed the book shut. The room went silent. For a long moment, Sophia remained on the ground, gasping for breath, the remnants of the pain still lingering in her chest like a dark shadow. The grimoire lay before her, closed and still. She had thought it was over, but the demon's presence was still there, swirling around her like smoke, filling her senses with an overwhelming sense of dread. She had barely survived the contact with the book, but she hadn't broken the curse, not yet. The demon was still tied to her blood, to the village, and to the very fabric of the darkness that had consumed them all. Slowly, Sophia stood, her body shaking from the ordeal. She had come this far, but now she realized how little she truly knew. The grimoire had not given her the answers she sought. It had only given her more questions, more fear, more uncertainty. She had touched the demon's power, and now it was a part of her. But there was one thing she was certain of. She would not allow the darkness to consume her. Not without a fight. She needed to find a way to use this power to turn it against the curse. But to do so, she would have to face the demon directly, and she would have to confront Esmeralda once more. The witch's magic was still tied to her blood, and it was clear now that the grimoire was only one piece of the puzzle. There was more to this curse, more to her bloodline, and Sophia knew that the true battle was only just beginning. Chapter 7. The Sacrifice of Blood. The night seemed to stretch on forever, suffocating the village under its dark blanket. Sophia could feel the weight of it on her chest as she sat in the dim glow of a single candle, the grimoire of eternal night open before her. The air in her room felt charged, thick with the presence of something ancient and malevolent. The demon's voice had not left her since the moment she touched the book. It still echoed in her mind, a constant gnawing presence that never let her forget its control over her. "You cannot escape me," it whispered relentlessly, its voice a serpent's hiss in the back of her thoughts. "Your blood is mine, and the curse will never release its grip." Sophia's breath quickened as she shut her eyes, trying to block out the demon's constant whispers. It had become impossible to sleep, impossible to think clearly without its dark presence clouding her mind. But even with its influence pressing down on her, she couldn't let herself fall into despair. She had a purpose now, one that was more terrifying than anything she had imagined. There was only one way to break the curse, and it was a path she had been warned about over and over: the sacrifice. The grimoire contained the ritual, a blood sacrifice of the firstborn, a life for a life. The demon had demanded it from the very beginning, and now it was asking for it again. Sophia had thought the curse could be broken by reading a simple spell, by finding the book, by uncovering its secrets. But it was never that simple. The true cost was not in knowledge, but in blood. Her blood. She was the one who had to give it, the one who would pay the price to release the village from its eternal nightmare. The thought of it chilled her to the core, but she knew it was the only way. Esmeralda, the witch who had sealed the sun all those years ago, had made a pact with the demon that bound the village forever. And now, that very pact had come full circle, wrapping around Sophia's soul like a noose. The firstborn of each generation was always the one chosen to pay the price. Her ancestors had agreed to it, and now it was her turn. But the ritual in the grimoire was different than what she had imagined. To break the curse, she had to offer herself her life, her soul, as the ultimate sacrifice. Only then would the sun rise again, and the darkness that had plagued the village for centuries would be broken. Sophia's hand trembled as she turned the pages of the grimoire, her mind racing with conflicting emotions. She had been prepared to fight, to find another way, but the path ahead seemed clear now. There was no other option. The curse had claimed her bloodline, and the price for redemption was her life. She stood up from the table, her legs shaky as she tried to steady herself. The book had revealed the ritual in great detail, everything from the location of the altar to the words of the incantation. She had no choice but to follow it. But something gnawed at her, something deep in her gut that made her hesitate. What would it mean to sacrifice herself? What would become of her body, her soul, after the ritual was complete? The grimoire offered no answers to these questions, only the cold certainty that the darkness would be undone if she followed through with it. But could she trust it? Could she trust the demon's promises? After everything she had seen, everything she had experienced, she knew she could not. The demon's power had already twisted her mind, seeped into her very blood. It had already claimed part of her, and the more she struggled against it, the more it fought back. But Sophia also knew that if she failed, if she hesitated now, the village would remain in eternal darkness, its people trapped in an endless night. Her family, her friends, the ones she loved, none of them would ever see the light of day again. And if she didn't go through with the ritual, the curse would only grow stronger. The demon would claim more lives, and the darkness would spread, swallowing everything in its path. The door to her room creaked open, and Sophia spun around, heart racing. Her mother Maria stood in the doorway, her face pale with worry. She had been keeping her distance since Sophia had begun her search, but now, seeing her daughter so lost in the grimoire, she couldn't bear it any longer. "Sophia?" Maria's voice trembled as she stepped into the room, her eyes searching Sophia's face. "What are you doing?" Sophia didn't know how to answer. How could she explain the weight of the decision she was about to make? How could she explain the power that had taken root inside her, the demon's voice that still echoed in her mind? How could she tell her mother that she had to die for the village to be freed? "It's the only way, Mom," Sophia whispered, her voice breaking as she spoke the words aloud. "The only way to stop it, to end the curse." Maria's face paled even further, and she reached out, her hands shaking as she tried to touch Sophia's arm. This can't be the answer. There has to be another way. You don't have to sacrifice yourself. There has to be a way to break the curse without—" "I wish there were," Sophia interrupted, her voice cold and distant. She had already accepted the truth, even if her heart wasn't ready for it. "But the grimoire, the demon, they've made it clear. I'm the one who has to pay the price. And if I don't, we'll all stay trapped in this darkness forever." Her mother's eyes filled with tears, and she stepped back, her hands clutching at her chest. "I can't lose you, Sophia. You're my daughter. I can't." Sophia could see the anguish in her mother's face, but there was nothing she could say to ease the pain. She had made up her mind. The darkness had already taken too much from them, and she couldn't let it take any more. If this was the price for breaking the curse, then she would pay it. There was no other choice. The room fell silent, the only sound the distant howling of the wind outside. Sophia turned back to the grimoire, her eyes scanning the final passages of the ritual. Her heart beat steadily now, no longer filled with fear, but with a cold determination. The path ahead was clear. She had to do this. For the village, for her family, for herself. Sophia reached for the candle, holding it steady as she moved towards the center of the room. It was time to prepare for the ritual. Time to accept her fate and embrace the darkness within her. Chapter 8. The Price of Freedom. The night grew heavier, the silence more oppressive as Sophia stood before the altar in the abandoned church. The grimoire of eternal night lay open in her hands, its pages trembling as if the book itself understood the weight of the ritual that was about to unfold. Her fingers, cold with fear and resolve, traced the lines of the incantation that would summon the demon and seal her fate. Each word seemed to burn against her skin, each syllable a reminder that she was about to give everything, her life, her soul, her very essence, to break the curse. But despite the dread that clawed at her heart, Sophia felt an eerie calm settle over her. The path had been set before her. The village needed this. She needed this. The village was still cloaked in that unnatural darkness. It had been weeks since she had found the grimoire, and though she had done everything she could, every effort seemed in vain. The people moved about like shadows, their eyes hollow, their spirits dulled by the eternal night. Her mother had tried to convince her to run, to leave before it was too late, but Sophia couldn't. She had made her choice. There was no turning back now. Sophia's body trembled as she stepped closer to the altar. The church, long abandoned, seemed to come alive with the power of the ritual. The air thickened with an unseen pressure, and she could feel the walls closing in, as though the very structure of the building was watching her, waiting for the moment when she would give herself to the darkness. She glanced at the candles she had placed in a circle around the altar, each one representing a piece of her sacrifice, the final act. The demon would be summoned, and she would become the vessel to end the curse. The grimoire flickered in the candlelight, and Sophia felt the demon's presence creeping into the space, as if it were hovering just beyond the edge of her vision. It had been with her ever since she had first touched the book, its whispers growing louder, more insistent as the ritual approached. She could hear it now, its voice curling around her thoughts like a serpent. "You are mine," the demon whispered, its voice cold and guttural. "You always have been. Your bloodline is my bloodline, and I will not let you go." Sophia's breath caught in her throat, but she pushed the fear down. She couldn't let it control her. The demon wanted her to break, to crumble under the weight of its influence, but Sophia had already chosen her path. No matter what the demon said, no matter how it tried to manipulate her, she was going to finish what she had started. She knelt before the altar, placing the grimoire down gently on the cold stone. The book glowed faintly, its pages now rustling, as though the demon itself was urging her to begin. Her hand hovered over the dagger she had placed next to the book, a ceremonial blade, its edge darkened by the blood of generations. Her blood would join that of her ancestors in the sacrifice. Her blood would fuel the ritual that would sever the curse from the village forever. As Sophia's fingers closed around the dagger's hilt, the wind outside began to howl, a storm gathering strength, as if the very earth itself knew what was about to happen. The candles flickered violently, casting strange, grotesque shadows against the walls. Sophia's heart raced, but she knew this was the only way. She had already walked too far into the darkness to turn back now. The ground beneath her feet shook, and the temperature dropped, her breath coming out in cold puffs that seemed to vanish into the air. The demon's laughter filled the space, mocking her. "You think your blood will be enough to break me? You are nothing but a child playing with forces you do not understand. I own you, Sophia. I always have." With a sharp breath, Sophia drove the dagger into her palm, the blade sinking deep into her skin. The pain was immediate, searing, but it was nothing compared to the storm that began to build inside her. Blood poured from the wound, dripping onto the stone altar, soaking into the ground beneath her. The air hummed with power, and the grimoire began to glow, its pages turning as though caught in an invisible wind. The ritual had begun. Sophia gritted her teeth, focusing on the task at hand. As her blood spilled onto the altar, she spoke the incantation from the book, her voice steady despite the panic bubbling beneath the surface. "By the blood of the firstborn, by the curse that binds, I offer myself in the name of freedom. I break the chains. I release the sun." The darkness in the room thickened, swirling around her like a tangible force. She felt the demon's presence growing stronger, its power rising with every word she spoke. But she refused to be intimidated. She had come this far, and there was no turning back. With each breath, she felt herself slipping further into the ritual, her blood mixing with the ancient power that had held the village captive for centuries. Suddenly, a roar erupted from the depths of the earth, the ground shaking violently as if something massive was awakening. Sophia's vision blurred, and the church seemed to dissolve around her, the walls warping and bending as though they were no longer bound by the laws of reality. Her body felt like it was being torn apart, the pain unbearable, yet she continued. The demon's voice screamed in fury, but Sophia kept speaking, her words growing louder, more defiant. "You will not control me," she shouted, her voice reverberating through the church. "You will not claim my soul." With a final guttural cry, she slammed the dagger into the altar, the blade embedding deep into the stone. There was a moment of complete silence, a stillness that seemed to stretch on forever, before the world seemed to explode with light. A blinding flash filled the room, and Sophia felt her body jerk as if she were being pulled apart. The power coursing through her felt like a tidal wave, crashing over every fiber of her being. The air was thick with smoke, and for a moment, She couldn't breathe. The darkness, the demon, the curse, it all seemed to collide in that moment, merging into one chaotic force. But then, as quickly as it had started, everything went still. The pain, the power, the storm, all of it vanished in an instant. Sophia fell to her knees, gasping for air, her vision swimming. The grimoire lay on the altar, now closed, its power spent. The room was eerily silent. Sophia had done it. The curse had been broken, but at what cost? Chapter 9. The Rise of the Sun. The silence that followed the ritual was suffocating. Sophia remained kneeling on the cold stone floor, her body trembling from the ordeal, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her hand clutched the altar, as if it might help steady her, though the world around her was spinning. The power she had unleashed still hummed through her veins, a dark fire that now felt strangely muted, as though it were retreating, fading into the distance. The demon's voice, that persistent whisper in her mind, had fallen silent. She could feel the weight of her sacrifice, the price she had paid. Her blood, still staining the altar, marked the point of no return. She had given everything. The darkness had been shattered. The curse that had plagued her family, her village, for centuries was broken. But there was no moment of triumph, no relief from the weight pressing down on her chest. She could feel the demon's presence lingering in the air, just beyond the edges of her consciousness, like a shadow she could not shake. It wasn't over. Not yet. The church around her was still, save for the distant creaking of its aged beams. But something had changed. The air felt lighter, less oppressive, as though the very fabric of reality had been altered. Sophia slowly rose to her feet, her limbs weak and unsteady. Her vision swam as she reached for the grimoire, now closed and still, its power spent for the moment. She knew what was coming. The sun was about to rise, but first, there was Esmeralda to deal with. Sophia turned toward the back of the church, where the shadows seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The air felt thick with malevolence. She could feel the presence of the witch, could sense her dark magic swirling like a storm about to break. The confrontation she had been dreading was finally here. Esmeralda had been the one to bind the village in eternal night, the one who had struck the unholy deal with the demon. Now, Sophia had to face her, had to destroy the woman who had cursed her bloodline. The witch's figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, gaunt figure draped in black, her face hidden behind a veil of dark hair. Esmeralda's eyes gleamed with malice, her lips curling into a smile that sent chills down Sophia's spine. "You think you've won?" Esmeralda's voice was low, mocking, filled with contempt. "You think you can break the pact that has bound us for centuries? You are nothing, child. You always have been." Sophia's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let the fear take hold of her. She had come this far. She had made her sacrifice, had broken the curse. Esmeralda's words held no power over her now. "I've broken the curse, Esmeralda," Sophia said, her voice steady. "The village is free. Your darkness ends here." Esmeralda laughed, a cold, hollow sound that seemed to reverberate off the stone walls. "The village is free? The darkness is gone? You know nothing. You are merely a pawn, a tool to be used. The sun may rise, but the price for your foolishness will be far greater than you can imagine." The witch's hands began to glow with an eerie light, the air crackling with dark magic. "The demon and I made a pact, little girl. The curse is not just a spell, it is a bond. And you, Sophia, are the final piece. You think you can break it? You can never escape what is in your blood." Sophia's grip tightened around the dagger that still hung at her side. She had already made the sacrifice, but she knew the fight was far from over. Esmeralda was powerful, far more powerful than Sophia had anticipated, but the demon was gone. The grimoire had severed its hold, and with it, the darkness that had controlled the village for centuries. Sophia could feel the remnants of that power inside her, and she was determined to use it. With a shout, Esmeralda raised her hands, and a bolt of dark energy shot toward Sophia. It moved so fast that Sophia barely had time to react, but she raised the dagger just in time, and the bolt collided with it, sending a shockwave through her body. The pain was immediate, But Sophia stood firm, refusing to fall. The energy from the ritual still surged through her, protecting her, fueling her. "You are weak," Esmeralda spat, her eyes narrowing. "You cannot defeat me. You cannot defeat the bond we share." Sophia's chest heaved as she fought to catch her breath. She could feel the power within her now, the remnants of the ritual that had been forced upon her. It was a dark power, but it was hers. She would not let Esmeralda win. "You're wrong," Sophia said, her voice a whisper, but full of conviction. "The darkness doesn't own me. It never will again." She rushed forward, faster than she had ever moved before, driven by the power she had unwillingly inherited. Esmeralda raised a hand to defend herself, but Sophia was already there, slashing the dagger through the air. The blade caught the witch's arm, and Esmeralda screamed in fury. The magic in the air twisted violently, and for a moment, it seemed as if the entire world was collapsing in on itself. Sophia pressed forward, ignoring the burning pain in her chest, ignoring the demon's voice whispering its final threats in her ear. She had to do this. She had to finish it. With a final, desperate cry, Sophia drove the dagger into Esmeralda's chest, piercing the witch's heart. The dark energy that had surrounded them both shattered in an instant, and Esmeralda's body crumpled to the floor, lifeless. The power that had bound the village for so long was gone, but Sophia didn't stop there. She knew the final act was still to come. The demon might be gone, but the curse was not truly broken until the sun rose, until the eternal night was banished for good. She staggered toward the altar, her limbs weak but determined. With one final look at the grimoire, she whispered the last words of the ritual, "For the blood of the firstborn, for the sun." The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the air grew still. A brilliant light pierced through the cracks in the church's walls, flooding the room with warmth. The darkness, which had clung to the village for so long, began to recede, vanishing like smoke in the wind. Outside, the sky began to change. The first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, casting their golden light over the village. The eternal night was finally over, but as Sophia stood there, watching the light spread across the land, she felt something in her shift. The weight of the darkness had been lifted, but at what cost? She had given everything, her blood, her life, her soul, to break the curse, and now she would have to live with the consequences of her actions. Sophia's body, once full of power, now felt hollow, as though the very essence of her had been drained. The village was free. The sun had risen, but Sophia had given it all. The price had been paid. Chapter 10. The Last Light. The first rays of dawn broke across the sky, spilling into the village like molten gold. The eternal night that had shrouded the town for centuries was finally over, its oppressive darkness lifting like a heavy fog. As the sunlight bathed the land, the villagers began to stir. Eyes, once hollow and lifeless, now blinked in the pale light of morning. It was as if they had been sleeping for a lifetime, trapped in a nightmare that had finally ended. The air was still, the weight of centuries of silence finally dissipating. Sophia stood in the ruins of the church, her knees buckling beneath her. The adrenaline that had carried her through the battle with Esmeralda had now abandoned her, leaving her body aching, trembling. The dagger, still clutched in her hand, felt heavy, as though it too carried the burden of the life it had taken. Her vision swam, and she swayed on her feet. The energy from the ritual now spent, the power that had once surged through her body, leaving her feeling empty. She had done it. The curse was broken, the demon was gone, and the village was free. But at what cost? The altar was silent, the grimoire closed and motionless. The witch Esmeralda, who had been the source of the eternal night, lay sprawled at Sophia's feet, her body lifeless, a final testament to the power the dark magic had once wielded. With her death, the last thread of the curse had been severed, and the balance of power had shifted. But Sophia knew there was more to her journey than just the destruction of the witch. There was a final reckoning waiting for her. She could feel it in her bones. Sophia staggered towards the door of the church, her steps faltering, as though the very weight of the world was pressing down on her shoulders. The sunlight outside was blinding after so many years of darkness. She shielded her eyes, squinting against the brightness. The village lay before her, still and quiet, its buildings cast in the soft glow of morning light. For a moment, Sophia thought she might be dreaming. Could it really be over? Is it truly gone? A voice asked from behind her, soft, but filled with wonder. Sophia turned to see her mother, standing in the doorway of the church, her face pale and drawn. The years of suffering, of living under the weight of the curse, had aged her far beyond her years. But now, in the light of the new day, her face was softer, almost serene. The woman who had once urged Sophia to run, to flee the village, now seemed to have found a peace she hadn't known in years. "Yes," Sophia whispered, her voice hoarse. "It's gone. The curse. It's broken." Her mother stepped forward, her eyes searching Sophia's face with a mix of hope and fear. "And you? What happened to you, Sophia? Your blood? It's still so dark." Sophia glanced down at her hand, where the dagger had stained her skin with the blood of the ritual. The dark magic that had coursed through her veins had not disappeared entirely. It lingered, as if a part of her soul had been left behind, bound to the darkness she had fought to destroy. Her heart ached, and the emptiness inside her felt like a void that could never be filled. "I don't know," Sophia admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what's left of me." Her mother took her hand, warm and steady, offering a comfort that Sophia desperately needed. "You saved us, Sophia. You saved us all. That's what matters." Sophia nodded, though the words felt hollow. She had saved them, yes, but at what cost? Her bloodline, her soul, her very existence was forever tainted by the magic she had unleashed. She had made the ultimate sacrifice, given everything she had to break the curse, and yet a part of her wondered if she had truly freed herself, or if the darkness would always be a part of her now, a shadow she could never escape. As Sophia and her mother stood there, watching the village come to life with the first true sunrise in centuries, Sophia couldn't help but wonder about the future. What would become of the people who had lived in the shadow of the eternal night? Would they remember the terror they had endured, the lives lost to the curse? Or would they simply rejoice in the dawn of a new era, unaware of the cost that had been paid to bring them this freedom? The village was waking up, yes, but Sophia wasn't sure if she could ever truly wake up from the nightmare that had been her life. The price of freedom had been steep, and though the sun now shone brightly, the shadows in her heart would remain forever. "I need to leave," Sophia said suddenly, her voice firm despite the uncertainty swirling within her. "I need to understand what happened to me. I need to know if I can ever be whole again." Her mother's eyes filled with sorrow, but she nodded, understanding the weight of Sophia's words. "I'll always be here for you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You'll find your way." Sophia hugged her mother tightly, feeling the warmth of her embrace seep into her bones. For a moment, the world stood still, and Sophia allowed herself to feel the peace that had been so elusive. But as she pulled away, she knew the journey wasn't over. There were still questions, still fears, still darkness within her that needed to be confronted. The villagers had begun to gather in the town square, their faces turned toward the sky, basking in the sunlight that had finally broken through the clouds. But as Sophia walked away, toward the edge of the village and into the unknown, she realized that she couldn't stay here. She couldn't live in the place that had once been her prison. She needed to find answers. She needed to discover what had happened to her, and whether there was a way to reclaim the part of her that had been lost in the darkness. And as she stepped into the sunlight, she knew one thing for certain. The curse had been broken, but her story was far from over.